Welcome, weary seeker of ancient truths, to a journey into the deepest mysteries of the Age of Fire. Tonight, we venture beyond the familiar tales of gods and dragons to explore the most enigmatic figure of all, the furtive Pygmy. So easily forgotten, yet so fundamentally important to everything that follows. Here in this place between waking and dreams, we shall trace the shadowed path of humanity's true origin, uncover the secrets of the dark soul, and understand why the smallest of the first beings would become the most significant of all. Close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and prepare to discover the truth that lies hidden in the darkness between the flames. In the beginning, before memory could take hold, before history had meaning to record, there existed a world that knew neither change nor variation. This was the Age of Ancients, a time so removed from our current understanding that its very nature challenges the mind's ability to comprehend what existence might mean without the fundamental forces that now define reality. Picture, if you can, a realm of perfect uniformity, where the concept of difference had never taken root, where the very idea of transformation remained unborn in the twilight between being and non-being. The world stretched endlessly in all directions, shrouded by mists that rolled between towering arch trees like the breath of some vast, slumbering consciousness. These were not mists as we understand them now, touched by light and shadow, warm and cool, but something altogether more primordial, a grey uniformity that knew no distinction between here and there, now and then, self and other. The fog moved in patterns that had remained unchanged since the dawn of existence, following currents that obeyed laws so ancient and fundamental that they had become indistinguishable from the fabric of reality itself. Above this endless expanse of grey twilight, the everlasting dragons made their domain among the branches of the arch trees, those impossibly massive structures that served as pillars supporting a sky that knew no sun, no moon, no stars to break the perfect monotony of existence. The dragons were not rulers in any sense that minds shaped by disparity could comprehend, for there was nothing to rule, no subjects to command, no territory to govern or defend. They simply were, as eternal and unchanging as the stone scales that covered their ancient forms, as permanent as the mists that swirled endlessly around their roosts. These magnificent beings existed in perfect harmony with their world because they were, in every essential way, expressions of the same fundamental principle that governed all existence in that primordial age. They knew neither birth nor death, for such concepts belonged to a reality where change was possible, where one state of being could give way to another. They experienced neither joy nor sorrow, neither desire nor satisfaction, for these emotions arose only in minds capable of distinguishing between what is and what might be. The dragons were complete unto themselves, perfectly adapted to a world where adaptation was unnecessary, supremely powerful in a realm where power had no meaning because there was nothing to overcome or transform. The arch trees that supported their domain were not alive as we understand life, for they required no nourishment, felt no seasons, experienced no growth or decay. They stretched upward into the endless fog with a patience that transcended time itself, their massive trunks serving as platforms where the dragons could rest between flights that had no destination, journeys without purpose through a landscape that offered no variety to reward exploration. These trees were monuments to permanence, testimonies to a kind of existence where the very concept of impermanence had no place or meaning. Time, that force which would later become the measure of all change, the framework within which growth and decay would unfold their eternal dance, had no significance in this age of perfect stasis. Moments did not follow one another in sequence because there was nothing to mark one instant as different from another. The mists swirled in patterns that had persisted for eons and would continue unchanged for eons more, their movements as predictable and meaningless as the turning of wheels that ground nothing, accomplished nothing, transformed nothing into something else. Yet even in the most changeless of ages, even in the deepest stasis, the seeds of transformation lie dormant, waiting for the proper conditions to manifest their hidden potential. The perfection of the Age of Ancients carried within itself the very forces that would eventually bring about its end, not through any external invasion or catastrophe, but through the natural tendency of existence itself to explore all possibilities, to exhaust every potential configuration of being before moving on to discover new forms of reality. And so it was that one day, in a realm where days had no meaning, something unprecedented occurred. Deep beneath the grey earth, in places where even the ancient dragons did not venture, in caverns that existed beyond the reach of the eternal fog, a light began to kindle. It was small at first, barely more than a spark, but in a world that had known only uniformity, even the tiniest deviation was revolutionary beyond measure. Fire, the first flame, born from nothing, emerging from emptiness like a star blazing to life in the void between worlds. With its appearance came something the universe had never experienced: disparity, light and dark, heat and cold, life and death. All the countless divisions that would define existence from that moment forward began to unfold from this single point of brilliant transformation. The flame burned with a light that was more than illumination, a heat that was more than warmth. It was possibility itself, the potential for change made manifest in dancing tongues of living fire. The appearance of the first flame marked the beginning of the end for the grey twilight that had defined all existence since time immemorial. As its light spread through the ancient realm, the fog that had rolled unchanging between the arch trees for countless eons began to recede, revealing landscapes that had been hidden since the dawn of being. The perfect uniformity of the Age of Ancients began to fracture along lines that followed the flame's influence, creating spaces where new forms of existence might take root and flourish. From the darkness that the flame's light created by its very presence, for light without shadow is impossible. Warmth without cold is meaningless. The first humanoid beings emerged. These early creatures were hollow and indistinct, their forms barely more substantial than the mists from which they had emerged. But they possessed something that had never existed before in the grey world: the capacity for wonder, for curiosity, for the kind of consciousness that could perceive difference and find meaning in the act of perception itself. These hollow beings wandered through the transformed landscape with movements that spoke of newfound awareness, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had changed. They moved through the receding mists with a kind of desperate hunger, drawn by something they could not name toward a source of warmth and light that promised answers to questions they were only beginning to learn how to ask. The world that had seemed so permanent, so unchangeable, was revealing itself to be malleable beyond imagination, full of possibilities that had never before existed. As these wandering souls drew closer to the source of the great transformation, they discovered that the first flame contained within its dancing heart something miraculous beyond their ability to fully comprehend: souls. Not the simple animating force that moves the body through its daily functions, but true souls, concentrated essence of the flame itself, fragments of the divine fire that had shattered the age of stasis and opened the door to infinite possibility. Within the heart of the flame, 4 souls burned brighter than all others. 4 Lord Souls that contained within their essence the power to reshape reality according to entirely new principles. These were not merely sources of energy or tools for accomplishing tasks, but fundamental forces that would define the nature of existence itself in the age that was about to begin. Each soul represented a different aspect of the disparity that the flame had brought into being, a different approach to the challenge of creating meaning and purpose in a world where such concepts had never before been necessary. The first of these mighty souls blazed with the fierce radiance of lightning, containing within its essence the power of light itself in its most pure and concentrated form. This soul was claimed by a being who would become known as Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, whose very presence seemed to drive back the shadows and illuminate the dark corners of existence with brilliant, unwavering radiance. Gwyn's soul granted him dominion over the forces that would establish order and hierarchy in the new world, making him a beacon of illumination around which others might gather to build the first civilizations. The second Lord Soul carried within it the concept of ending, the necessity of death that gives weight and meaning to life by establishing boundaries and limitations. This soul was taken by the being who would become known as Nito, the first of the dead, whose understanding of conclusion and termination would prove essential to the proper functioning of the world that was about to emerge. Where Gwyn's soul blazed with creative force and the energy of beginning, Nito's burned with the quiet flame of completion, the wisdom that recognizes when things have reached their proper end and should be allowed to rest. The third Lord Soul fell to the being who would become known as the Witch of Izalith, whose essence became entwined with the primal forces of flame and creation in their most nurturing aspects. Her soul contained the knowledge of how to guide and shape fire, how to coax it into new forms and applications, how to use its power for the creation of beauty and the sustaining of life. She would become the mother of new flames, the one who understood better than any other how the first flame's power might be preserved, cultivated, and propagated throughout the world that was being born. But there was a fourth soul, different from the others, in ways that would not become apparent until much later in the great story that was about to unfold. This was the dark soul, easily overlooked in the brilliant radiance of its companions, dismissed by those who measured importance in terms of obvious power and immediate impact. Unlike the other Lord Souls, which blazed with dramatic and unmistakable might, the dark soul was subtle in its manifestation, its true strength hidden in shadow and silence, patient in its power, profound in its implications. The dark soul was found by a small, seemingly insignificant being who would come to be known only as the Furtive Pygmy. This individual appeared unremarkable when compared to the mighty figures who had claimed the other Lord Souls, lacking their imposing stature, their obvious charisma, their natural authority. The Pygmy was small where the others were grand, quiet where they were commanding, secretive where they were bold. In the great drama that was beginning to unfold, this figure seemed destined to play a minor role, easily forgotten in the shadow of more spectacular personalities. Yet the dark soul that the Furtive Pygmy discovered possessed qualities that made it fundamentally different from its more obviously powerful companions. While Gwyn's lightning, Nito's death, and the Witch's flame were complete unto themselves, concentrated forces that could be wielded by single individuals, the dark soul was something altogether more complex and mysterious. It was not whole in the same way the others were whole, not finished in the same way they were finished. Instead, it was potential, possibility, the raw material from which something entirely new might be created. The Furtive Pygmy understood perhaps through some intuitive wisdom that the others lacked, that the Dark Soul's true power lay not in being hoarded like the other Lord's souls, but in being shared, divided, spread among many, rather than concentrated in one. This insight would prove to be one of the most significant decisions in the history of existence, though its full implications would not become clear for ages to come. Where the other lords kept their souls as sources of personal power, the Pygmy chose a different path entirely. The decision to fragment the Dark Soul represented a radically different philosophy of power and existence, one that valued connection over domination, community over hierarchy, growth over preservation. The Pygmy seemed to understand intuitively that true strength comes not from individual might but from the bonds that link all living things, that the most enduring forms of power are those that multiply when shared, rather than diminishing through division. As the first flame established the fundamental principles that would govern the new age, as disparity took root and began to transform the grey world of the ancients into something rich with possibility, the stage was set for conflicts and alliances that would shape the destiny of all existence. The four holders of the Lord's souls found themselves in a world still dominated by the ancient dragons, those magnificent remnants of the age of perfect stasis who represented everything the new era sought to move beyond. The dragons' immortality, their resistance to change, their perfect adaptation to a world without growth or transformation, all of this marked them as obstacles to the age of fire and disparity that the Lord's soul-bearers were preparing to establish. They were not evil in any conventional sense, but they belonged to the old world, the grey world, the world without meaning or development. If the new age was to flourish, if the potential contained within the first flame was to be realized, the dragons would have to be challenged, their dominion ended, their perfect stasis broken to make room for the dynamic forces of change and growth. The confrontation that was approaching would not be merely a battle between different groups of powerful beings, but a conflict between two entirely different visions of what existence should mean. Two fundamentally incompatible approaches to the question of how reality should be organized and maintained. The outcome would determine whether the world would return to the comfortable emptiness of eternal sameness, or embrace the dangerous beauty of constant transformation. The alliance that formed between the holders of the Lord's souls was born not from friendship or shared ideology, but from the cold recognition that their individual visions for the new world required the dragon's ancient order to be overthrown. Gwyn, with his blazing soul of light and lightning, understood that his dream of illuminated civilization could never flourish while the grey twilight of the dragons cast its shadow over all existence. Nito, bearing the soul of death itself, recognized that in a world of immortal beings, his domain over endings and conclusions would remain forever incomplete and meaningless. The Witch of Izalith, whose mastery over flame promised to bring warmth and creation to the cold expanses of the ancient world, saw in the dragon's perfect stasis an impediment to the growth and change that fire naturally encouraged. And the furtive Pygmy, small and easily overlooked among these mighty figures, carried within the fragments of the dark soul a vision of something the dragons had never known and could never accept: the power of many working together, the strength that comes from shared purpose rather than solitary perfection. Yet, even as this alliance took shape, the first signs of future discord were already becoming apparent to those wise enough to perceive them. Gwyn's soul blazed with such brilliant intensity that it seemed to push back the very darkness from which disparity had emerged, creating an illumination so complete that it left no room for the subtle shadows where the furtive Pygmy's power was most at home. The Lord of Sunlight's vision for the new world was one of ordered hierarchy, of light ruling over darkness, of the powerful protecting and governing the weak according to principles of divine authority. This vision, noble in its intentions and magnificent in its scope, carried within it assumptions about the proper ordering of reality that would eventually bring Gwyn into conflict with the very nature of the dark soul and those who bore its fragments. The Pygmy's decision to divide the dark soul among many, rather than keeping it concentrated in a single vessel, represented a fundamentally different philosophy of power, one that valued growth and adaptation over stability and control, change over preservation, the wisdom of many over the authority of one. But these philosophical differences remained hidden beneath the surface during the early days of their alliance, overshadowed by the immediate necessity of confronting the dragons and the monumental challenge that such a confrontation would represent. The everlasting dragons were not merely powerful opponents, but living embodiments of the natural order that had governed existence since the beginning of time. Their stone scales were not simply armor, but conduits through which the fundamental forces of immortality and unchanging perfection flowed into their beings. To challenge the dragons was to challenge the very concept of permanence itself, to assert that change and growth were more valuable than eternal stability, that the uncertainty of transformation was preferable to the security of stasis. This was not a decision that any of the Lord's soul-bearers made lightly, for they understood that victory would bring not only triumph, but responsibility for whatever would emerge from the ruins of the old order. The war that followed would test not only their individual strength, but their ability to work together despite their fundamentally different natures and goals. Gwyn's lightning, brilliant and destructive, could shatter stone and burn away the ancient mists, but it required the support of his allies to be truly effective against enemies who had survived unchanged since the dawn of existence. Nito's mastery over death gave him power over forces that could end even immortal lives. But the dragon's resistance to change made them difficult targets for his necromantic arts. The Witch of Izalith brought to the Alliance her deep understanding of flame in all its forms, her ability to kindle new fires and shape them according to her will. But even her greatest infernos seemed small when compared to the vast, cold perfection of the dragon's domain. And the furtive Pygmy, smallest and seemingly weakest of the four, contributed something that the others initially failed to recognize as significant: the power of human will, multiplied across countless individual souls, each one small but collectively, representing a force that no single being, however mighty, could hope to match. The humans who followed the furtive Pygmy into battle were unlike any warriors the world had previously known. Where the followers of other lords fought as extensions of their master's will, drawing their strength from concentrated sources of power, the humans fought with a kind of desperate creativity that came from their fragmented nature. Each carried only a small piece of the dark soul, but this limitation forced them to rely on cooperation, innovation, and adaptation in ways that the more powerful servants of the other lords never needed to develop. Their weapons and armor, forged in the depths where darkness was strongest, possessed qualities that disturbed even their allies. These were not tools created through conventional craftsmanship, but artifacts born from the intersection of human will and the strange properties of the dark soul itself. The metal seemed to drink in light rather than reflecting it, and those who wielded these weapons reported that they grew stronger through use, as if they were learning from each battle, adapting to overcome whatever resistance they encountered. Gwyn, observing these dark armaments with a mixture of admiration and unease, made a decision that would echo through all the ages that followed. To ensure that the humans' weapons served the Alliance's goals without growing beyond his ability to control, he placed seals of fire upon them, binding their dark power with his own radiant energy. This act, presented as a blessing that would make the weapons more effective against the dragons, was in truth the first step in a long campaign to contain and limit humanity's potential. The humans who received these sealed weapons felt the change immediately. The adaptive, evolutionary quality of their armaments was muted, channeled into forms that Gwyn's light could predict and direct. They remained effective tools of war, but they had lost something essential in the process of being improved, the capacity for true growth, for becoming something more than their creators had originally envisioned. Yet the humans accepted this limitation with the same patience and adaptability that characterized all their responses to the challenges they faced. They understood, perhaps better than Gwyn himself, that this was not truly about the war against the dragons, but about establishing the principles that would govern whatever came after victory was achieved. By accepting the seals upon their weapons, they demonstrated a willingness to work within the constraints that their more powerful allies deemed necessary, while quietly maintaining their own deeper purposes. The dragons, for their part, received the declaration of war with something approaching incomprehension. Conflict, in the sense that the Lord Soul-Bearers understood it, was a concept foreign to their nature. They had never known defeat, because they had never truly known struggle, had never faced opponents capable of threatening their fundamental nature. Their immortality was not an achievement, but a basic fact of their existence, as natural and unremarkable as the mists that swirled around their arch-tree roosts. When the first attacks came, the dragons responded with the overwhelming force that their perfect adaptation to the ancient world provided, but without the strategic thinking or adaptive capability that true warfare required. Their fire could reduce entire armies to ash in moments. Their claws could shatter the strongest fortifications. Their wings could summon storms that blotted out whatever dim light filtered through the eternal fog. But these were not tactics in any meaningful sense, merely the natural expression of power that had never needed to be refined or focused through experience of genuine opposition. The early phases of the war went badly for the alliance of Lord Soul-Bearers, as their forces learned through bitter experience just how vast the gap was between their newfound power and the ancient might of beings who had never known weakness or limitation. For every dragon that fell to their combined assault, dozens of their followers perished, and there were moments when it seemed that the Age of Ancients might reassert itself through sheer force of accumulated power. But the dragons had a weakness, one that their perfect adaptation to the unchanging world had prevented them from recognizing or addressing. Their immortality, their resistance to change, their fundamental nature as beings of eternal stasis. All of these qualities depended upon their stone scales, those grey plates that covered their forms like living armor. The scales were not merely protection, but the very source of their transcendence over the normal laws of existence, channels through which the power of the ancient world flowed into their bodies and maintained their perfect state. This crucial secret was revealed through an act of betrayal that would become one of the defining moments of the entire war. Seath the Scaleless, born different from his brethren, lacking the stone scales that granted immortality, harbored resentments and desires that his fellow dragons could never understand. He had spent eons watching his kin enjoy the eternal existence that was denied to him, developing emotions and motivations that were foreign to the perfect stasis that characterized his race. When Gwyn approached Seath with an offer of alliance, promising him a place in the new order and a fragment of divine power to sustain his otherwise mortal existence, the scaleless dragon saw an opportunity for revenge that he could not resist. In exchange for revealing the secret of the scales and providing intelligence about dragon strongholds and movements, Seath would be granted a duchy among the gods and access to resources that might finally allow him to achieve the immortality that nature had denied him. The knowledge that Seath provided transformed the war from a struggle of attrition into a conflict with a clear path to victory. The Alliance forces learned to focus their attacks on the dragon's scales, using Gwyn's lightning to peel away the protective plates and expose the vulnerable flesh beneath. Once stripped of their scales, the immortal dragons became merely powerful beasts, still dangerous but no longer invincible, subject to the same forces of death and destruction that governed all other forms of life. The tide of war turned with dramatic swiftness once this technique was mastered. Dragon after dragon fell to the concentrated assault of the Lord Soulbearers and their followers. Their ancient roosts stormed and claimed, their perfect forms reduced to corpses that would decay like any other fallen creature. The arch trees that had served as pillars supporting the grey world became monuments to the dragon's defeat, their branches empty of the immortal beings who had perched there since the beginning of time. The few dragons that survived this great purge fled to the far corners of the world, seeking places where they might hide from the wrath of the new lords, and perhaps preserve some remnant of the age that was passing away. Some retreated to valleys shrouded in ash, others to remote peaks where the mists still lingered, and still others to deep caverns where the old ways might endure hidden from the light of the new age. They would become legends in the world that emerged from their defeat, remembered in whispered tales as remnants of a time when the world was fundamentally different. With the dragons defeated and the old order overthrown, the Age of Fire could truly begin. The victory belonged to all four of the Lord's Soulbearers, but it was Gwyn who emerged as the dominant figure in the new hierarchy, his radiant power and natural authority making him the obvious choice to lead the civilization that would rise from the ashes of the ancient world. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, the seeds of future conflict were already taking root. The furtive Pygmy, whose contribution to the victory had been significant but largely unrecognized, quietly withdrew from the celebrations and grand plans that occupied the other lords. The humans who had fought so bravely under the Pygmy's guidance found themselves relegated to secondary roles in the new order, their adaptive nature and collective strength viewed with suspicion rather than admiration by those who preferred more hierarchical forms of organization. Seath the Scaleless, rewarded for his betrayal with a place among the victors, began the research into immortality that would eventually consume his sanity and transform him into something monstrous. His new domain in the Grand Archives provided him with resources and subjects for experiments that grew increasingly desperate and morally questionable as he pursued the eternal life that his treachery was supposed to have secured. The Witch of Izalith and Nito, the other two lords, established their own domains and began the work of creating the institutions and structures that would define the Age of Fire. But even they, mighty as they were, operated within frameworks that Gwyn's vision had largely established, accepting roles as powerful but subordinate figures in a cosmic order that placed the Lord of Sunlight at its apex. The world that emerged from the dragon's defeat was bright with promise and heavy with possibility, but it carried within its foundations the tensions and contradictions that would eventually tear it apart. The alliance that had made victory possible was already beginning to fracture along lines that reflected the fundamental differences between the Lord Souls and those who wielded them. The Age of Fire had begun, but its ultimate fate was already being written in the choices made by those who claimed dominion over the new reality they had created through conquest and sacrifice. In the aftermath of victory, as the smoke of battle cleared and the new lords surveyed the transformed landscape that their triumph had revealed, the furtive Pygmy made a decision that would prove to be the most significant act in the history of existence, though its full implications would remain hidden for ages to come. Unlike the other Lord Soulbearers, who kept their divine essence concentrated within themselves as sources of personal power and authority, the Pygmy chose a radically different path that reflected a fundamentally different understanding of what strength truly meant. The fragmentation of the dark soul was not an act of weakness or desperation, but a deliberate choice born from wisdom that transcended the conventional thinking of the age. The Pygmy understood, through some intuitive insight that the other lords lacked, that the dark soul's true nature was not to be hoarded like treasure or wielded like a weapon, but to be shared, divided, spread among many, so that its power might grow rather than diminish through distribution. This decision would transform the dark soul from a single mighty force into something far more profound and enduring, the animating spirit of an entire race. The process of fragmentation was not a simple matter of breaking something whole into smaller pieces, but a complex transformation that changed the fundamental nature of the dark soul itself. Each fragment that the Pygmy separated from the original contained not just a portion of the whole, but the entire essence of darkness compressed into a form that could exist within an individual consciousness. These fragments were complete unto themselves while remaining connected to every other fragment, creating a network of shared essence that linked all who bore them in bonds deeper than blood or kinship. From these fragments of the dark soul, humanity was born, not created in the sense that a craftsman creates an object or a god creates a creature, but born in the truest sense, emerging naturally from the interaction between the dark soul's essence and the hollow beings who had wandered from the darkness toward the first flame's light. The transformation was gradual, unfolding over generations as the fragments settled into their new homes and began to express their nature through the lives and choices of their bearers. The first humans were different from the hollow beings from which they had emerged in ways that went far beyond mere physical appearance. Where the hollows had been driven by simple hungers and basic needs, humans possessed something unprecedented: the capacity for genuine choice, for moral reasoning, for creating meaning through their actions, rather than simply responding to immediate stimuli. They could love and hate, hope and despair, create and destroy, all with an intensity and complexity that the hollow beings had never approached. But perhaps most significantly, humans possessed something that would prove both their greatest strength and their most dangerous quality: the ability to change, to grow, to become something other than what they had been. This capacity for transformation was a direct expression of the dark soul's nature, for darkness itself was change, the space between states of being where all possibilities existed simultaneously, where the gods drew their power from stable, unchanging sources. Humans drew theirs from their very mutability, their refusal to be bound by any fixed definition of what they should be. The early human settlements that began to appear throughout the transformed landscape reflected this fundamental adaptability in their organization and culture. Unlike the rigid hierarchies that characterized divine society, human communities developed fluid, responsive structures that could adjust to changing circumstances without losing their essential character. Leadership emerged naturally from competence and wisdom rather than being imposed through divine mandate, and decisions were made through processes that valued multiple perspectives rather than concentrating authority in single individuals. These communities were small at first, scattered groups of related families who had settled in areas where the dark soul fragments resonated most strongly with the natural environment. But they grew with remarkable speed, their adaptive nature allowing them to thrive in diverse conditions that would have challenged more specialized forms of life. Humans learned to cultivate the earth, to domesticate animals, to work metals and weave cloth, all with an inventiveness that seemed to draw directly from the creative potential contained within their souls. The relationship between early humanity and the other races that emerged during the Age of Fire was complex and often troubled. The gods who served Gwyn, viewed humans with a mixture of fascination and unease, recognizing in them qualities that were both admirable and potentially threatening. Humans could be loyal and dedicated servants when properly guided, but they also possessed an independence of thought and action that made them unreliable subjects for divine authority. The followers of Nito found humans unsettling for different reasons. Death, which was Nito's domain, and the organizing principle of his realm, seemed to affect humans in ways that defied conventional understanding. While other beings experienced death as a clear transition from one state to another, humans appeared to exist in a liminal space between life and death, their dark soul fragments allowing them to persist in forms that challenged the neat categories that Nito sought to maintain. The Witch of Izalith's relationship with humanity was perhaps the most harmonious during these early centuries. Her understanding of flame as a creative force resonated with the dark soul's capacity for transformation and growth. Human communities that developed near her domain often became centers of learning and artistic achievement, their inhabitants inspired by the witch's example to explore the boundaries of what was possible through the marriage of human creativity and divine wisdom. But it was with Gwyn that humanity's relationship proved most complex and ultimately most troubling. The Lord of Sunlight could not deny the value that humans brought to his realm. Their adaptability made them ideal subjects for colonizing new territories. Their creativity contributed to technological and cultural advances that benefited all of society, and their fragments of the dark soul provided them with a resilience that made them valuable in times of crisis. Yet this same resilience troubled Gwyn deeply, for he could see that it came from a source that operated according to principles fundamentally different from those that governed his own power. Where his authority was based on the concentration of divine force within himself and his chosen representatives, humanity's strength was distributed across countless individuals, each one carrying a fragment of power that connected them to every other human who had ever lived or would ever be born. The implications of this distributed power structure were staggering when contemplated in their full scope. If every human carried a fragment of the dark soul, then the collective power of humanity would continue to grow with every birth, every new life adding another piece to a puzzle that was already larger than any single divine soul. Given enough time, enough generations, enough growth in human population, this collective might could theoretically exceed even the combined power of all the gods. Gwyn's response to this realization was characteristically direct, but also profoundly short-sighted. Rather than seeking to understand the nature of the dark soul's power or finding ways to guide its development in directions that would benefit the entire realm, he chose to view it as a threat that needed to be contained and controlled. His solution was to remove humanity from the centers of power and influence, where their growing strength might challenge the established order. The creation of the Ringed City represented the culmination of this policy of containment disguised as honor. Far from Londor, at the very edge of the known world, Gwyn established a magnificent city that would serve as both prison and showcase, a place where humanity's greatest representatives could live in apparent luxury while being effectively isolated from the main currents of divine society. The city was beautiful beyond description, its architecture rivaling even Londo in its grandeur, but its true purpose was to serve as a cage for powers that Gwyn could not bring himself to destroy, but dared not allow to remain free. The Ringed Knights, who served as the city's guardians, were humans who had been elevated through their service in the war against the dragons, granted power and authority that seemed to mark them as favored subjects of divine rule. But their promotion also served to separate them from the broader human population, transforming them from representatives of humanity into agents of divine will. Their impressive armor and weapons, sealed with Gwyn's fire to prevent their dark nature from manifesting too freely, symbolized the complex relationship between divine authority and human potential. To ensure the cooperation of the Pygmy lords who would rule this distant city, Gwyn made a gesture that seemed generous, but carried within it the seeds of future tragedy. He sent his youngest daughter, Filianore, to serve as both princess and guardian of the ringed city, her presence a symbol of the bond between gods and humanity, while also serving as a living seal that would maintain the separation between light and dark. Filianore accepted this duty with the grace that befitted a daughter of gods, but in doing so, she condemned herself to an existence of eternal vigilance, forever watching over humanity's power, while never being able to return to her father's golden city. The furtive Pygmy's response to this elegant imprisonment was not the open rebellion that Gwyn might have expected, but something far more subtle and ultimately more effective. Rather than challenging the arrangement directly, the Pygmy accepted it, while quietly ensuring that the true purpose of the Dark Soul's fragmentation would continue to unfold according to its own internal logic. The humans who lived in the ringed city and those who remained in the broader world maintained their connection to each other and to their ultimate origin, creating networks of shared consciousness and purpose that operated beneath the surface of apparent compliance with divine authority. The humans who dwelt outside the ringed city adapted to their reduced status with the same flexibility that had served them during the war against the dragons. They became farmers and craftsmen, merchants and scholars, filling the essential but unglamorous roles that kept divine civilization functioning while their rulers focused on grander pursuits. But beneath their apparent acceptance of subordinate status, they maintained their connection to the dark soul fragments within them, slowly but steadily growing in wisdom and collective power. The children born to these early human communities carried dark soul fragments that were somehow both smaller and larger than those of their parents. Smaller because the continued fragmentation meant that each individual piece was less concentrated than before, but larger because each new fragment contained the accumulated experience and wisdom of all who had carried the dark soul before them. This paradox of diminishment and enhancement would prove to be one of the dark soul's most remarkable qualities. As generations passed, the human population grew not just in numbers, but in the depth and complexity of their connection to their shared essence. The dark soul fragments began to resonate with each other across vast distances, creating a form of communication and shared consciousness that operated entirely outside the structures of divine authority. Humans separated by continents could somehow sense each other's joys and sorrows, share insights and discoveries, coordinate their efforts in ways that no amount of conventional organization could have achieved. This growing network of shared consciousness represented something entirely new in the history of existence. The gods ruled through hierarchy and divine mandate, their authority flowing downward from concentrated sources of power to lesser beings who served as extensions of their will. But humanity operated according to principles that were more organic and egalitarian, their strength emerging from the connections between individuals rather than from submission to external authority. The implications of this difference became increasingly apparent as human communities continued to develop and mature. Their approaches to governance, to conflict resolution, to technological innovation, to artistic expression, all reflected the influence of the dark soul's fragmented nature. Where divine society valued permanence and perfection, human culture embraced change and experimentation. Where gods sought to establish eternal principles that would govern all future development, humans created flexible traditions that could evolve to meet new challenges and opportunities. The dark soul fragments within individual humans began to manifest in different ways depending on the circumstances of their bearers' lives and the challenges they faced. Some humans developed heightened empathy, their souls resonating so strongly with others that they could literally feel the emotions and experiences of those around them. Others found their fragments expressing themselves through enhanced creativity, allowing them to create works of art and literature that captured truths about existence that had never before been articulated. Still, others discovered that their dark soul fragments granted them abilities that approached the miraculous. They could heal injuries through touch, could see through illusions and deceptions that fooled other beings, could survive in environments that should have been lethal to normal life. These manifestations were not random but seemed to emerge in response to genuine need, as if the dark soul itself was actively working to ensure humanity's survival and growth. The diversity of these manifestations reflected the fundamental nature of the dark soul as a force of change and adaptation rather than rigid power. Unlike the other Lord Souls, which granted their bearers specific, unchanging abilities, the Dark Soul's fragments could express themselves in whatever form would be most beneficial to their bearers and their communities. This flexibility made humanity incredibly resilient, but also made them difficult for the gods to understand or predict. Gwyn's growing unease with humanity's development was not based on hatred or malice, but on a genuine fear that their adaptive nature made them fundamentally incompatible with the ordered civilization he sought to establish. Their tendency to question authority, to experiment with new ways of doing things, to form connections that operated outside official channels, all of this suggested that they might eventually challenge the divine order, not through rebellion, but through simple growth beyond the boundaries that had been established for them. The Lord of Sunlight's solution to this problem was characteristically direct, but also profoundly misguided in its assumptions about the nature of the dark soul and those who carried its fragments. He began to establish institutions and practices designed to channel human energy and creativity into forms that would serve divine purposes, while discouraging the kind of independent development that he found so threatening. Schools were founded that taught humans to see themselves as inherently inferior to divine beings, requiring divine guidance to achieve their potential. Religious organizations were established that encouraged humans to view their dark soul fragments not as sources of strength, but as marks of their fallen nature, reminders of their need for divine salvation and guidance. These institutions taught that the darkness within humanity was something to be suppressed and overcome rather than understood and integrated, creating internal conflicts that would eventually manifest as the psychological and spiritual problems that would plague human society for centuries to come. The most insidious aspect of these control mechanisms was that they operated by convincing humans to limit themselves, to suppress their own nature in service of ideals that were presented as universally beneficial, but actually served primarily to maintain divine supremacy. Humans were taught that ambition was dangerous, that questioning authority was sinful, that their greatest virtue lay in accepting whatever role the gods had assigned to them without complaint or aspiration for something greater. Yet even as these institutions of control spread throughout human society, the fundamental nature of the dark soul ensured that their influence would never be complete or permanent. The fragments within individual humans continued to resonate with each other, creating underground networks of shared consciousness that operated beneath the surface of official, religious, and social structures. These hidden connections allowed wisdom and truth to spread through human communities in ways that no amount of divine oversight could prevent or detect. The humans who maintained these secret connections began to develop their own understanding of their true nature and destiny, an understanding that differed dramatically from the teachings of the divine institutions. They came to see their dark soul fragments not as curses or marks of inferiority, but as gifts that connected them to something larger and more meaningful than individual existence. They understood that their capacity for change and growth was not a flaw to be corrected, but their greatest strength, the quality that would allow them to survive and thrive regardless of what challenges the future might bring. The furtive pygmy, though withdrawn from the grand councils and public ceremonies that marked the establishment of the Age of Fire, continued to watch over humanity's development with a patience and wisdom that transcended the immediate concerns that occupied the other lords. The pygmy understood that the true test of the Dark Soul's fragmentation would not come during these early, relatively peaceful centuries, but later, when the Age of Fire began to show its inherent instabilities and humanity would be forced to choose between accepting subjugation and asserting their true nature. The networks of human consciousness that were developing during this period would prove essential to humanity's survival during the dark times that lay ahead, when the undead curse eventually emerged, when the gods' attempts to maintain their artificial age began to create the very chaos they sought to prevent. Humanity would need these connections to maintain their sanity and purpose in the face of forces designed to strip away their identity and reduce them to mindless tools of divine will. But for now, in these golden centuries when the Age of Fire was young and full of promise, when the gods walked among mortals and the world seemed infinite in its potential for growth and beauty, these deeper currents of consciousness and purpose remained hidden beneath the surface of daily life. Humans tended their fields, raised their children, created their art, and built their communities, all while carrying within themselves fragments of power that connected them to the deepest mysteries of existence and to each other in ways that would prove unbreakable regardless of what trials lay ahead. The seeds of everything that would follow the undead curse, the cycles of linking and fading, the rise of human kingdoms, and their eventual challenges to divine authority were already present in these early communities, waiting for the proper conditions to manifest their full potential. The furtive pygmy's gift to humanity was not just the dark soul fragments themselves, but the wisdom embedded in the decision to fragment the soul, the understanding that true strength comes not from concentration of power, but from its multiplication across countless individual consciousnesses, working in harmony toward shared goals. As the Age of Fire established itself and the new order began to take shape according to Gwyn's vision of divine hierarchy and ordered civilization, the foundation for everything that would follow was quietly being laid in the small decisions and hidden connections of ordinary human lives. The furtive pygmy had planted seeds that would grow slowly but surely, their ultimate flowering still centuries in the future but already inevitable, already working their patient transformation of the world from within, rather than through the dramatic gestures that characterize divine action. The fragmented dark soul would prove to be more durable than any of the concentrated Lord souls, more adaptable than any divine institution, more persistent than any attempt at control or suppression. In choosing to distribute power rather than hoard it, to create many rather than remain one, the furtive pygmy had ensured that humanity would outlast every age, survive every catastrophe, and ultimately inherit whatever remained when all the gods' grand designs had run their course and revealed their fundamental limitations. As the centuries passed, and the Age of Fire established itself as the natural order of existence, Gwyn found his attention increasingly focused on what he perceived as the growing threat that humanity represented to the stability and permanence of his divine realm. The Lord of Sunlight's concerns were not born from malice or simple desire for domination, but from a genuine fear that the adaptive, unpredictable nature of humanity made them fundamentally incompatible with the ordered civilization he sought to create and preserve for all eternity. The networks of human consciousness that operated beneath the surface of official society, the tendency of human communities to develop their own solutions to problems rather than waiting for divine guidance, the way individual humans seemed capable of transcending the limitations that should have bound them all. Of these phenomena suggested to Gwyn that humanity was evolving in directions that could not be controlled or predicted through conventional means. Their very capacity for growth and change, the quality that made them so valuable as subjects and allies, also made them potentially dangerous to a system that depended on stability and unchanging hierarchy. Gwyn's solution to this perceived threat was characteristically ambitious in scope and deceptively generous in presentation. Rather than attempting to suppress or eliminate humanity directly, which would have created obvious conflicts and potentially driven them toward open rebellion, he chose a more subtle approach that would honor their contributions while ensuring that their power could never grow to challenge divine authority. The creation of the Ringed City represented the culmination of this strategy, a masterpiece of political maneuvering that transformed exile into honor and imprisonment into privilege. The location chosen for this grand project was significant in ways that would not become apparent until much later in the great story that was unfolding. At the very edge of the world, where the normal laws of space and time began to bend and warp under the influence of forces that predated even the Age of Ancients, Gwyn established a city that was both magnificent and isolated, connected to the centers of divine power, but separated from them by distances that were as much conceptual as physical. The Ringed City was not merely built but woven into the fabric of reality itself, its architecture defying conventional understanding of what was possible through normal construction techniques. The buildings seemed to grow from the earth rather than being placed upon it, their walls and towers following curves and angles that suggested they had been shaped by forces more fundamental than hammer and chisel. The very stones from which the city was constructed possessed qualities that made them responsive to the will and emotion of their inhabitants, creating living spaces that could adapt to the needs of those who dwelt within them. The rings that gave the city its name were not merely decorative elements, but functional components of a vast magical system designed to contain and channel the power of the dark soul fragments that its inhabitants carried within them. Each ring represented a different level of the city's hierarchy, a different degree of access to the deeper mysteries that lay at its heart. The outermost rings housed the ordinary citizens, those humans who had been granted the honor of dwelling in this magnificent place, but who remained subject to the same limitations that governed their kind. Throughout the broader realm, as one moved inward through the concentric circles of the city's organization, the inhabitants became more powerful, more deeply connected to the dark essence that defined their nature, but also more tightly bound by the subtle constraints that prevented that power from expressing itself in ways that might threaten the larger order. The innermost ring was reserved for the Pygmy lords, those descendants or representatives of the original Furtive Pygmy who had been granted authority over the city and its inhabitants as both honor and burden. The Ring Knights, who served as the city's guardians, were perhaps the most tragic figures in this elaborate arrangement. These were humans who had distinguished themselves during the war against the dragons, warriors whose courage and skill had earned them recognition and elevation beyond their original station. They had been transformed through divine intervention into beings of tremendous power, their bodies enhanced, their weapons and armor forged from materials that combined the best of human craftsmanship with divine technology. But this elevation came at a price that would not become apparent until centuries had passed, and the true nature of their transformation began to manifest. The armor they wore, magnificent in its appearance and formidable in its protective qualities, was not merely equipment, but a form of binding that connected them permanently to the divine will that had created their enhanced state. They could not remove it, could not set aside their duties, could not choose to live as ordinary humans. even if they desired to do so. Their weapons, forged in the deepest places where darkness and light intersected, possessed powers that seemed miraculous, but also carried within them the means of their bearer's control. Each blade, each spear, each shield was inscribed with seals of fire that bound their dark nature to patterns that Gwyn could predict and direct. The weapons grew stronger through use, adapting to their wielder's needs and preferences, but always within limits that ensured they would never become threats to the divine order they were meant to protect. The process of creating these enhanced warriors had required Gwyn to study the nature of the dark soul more deeply than he had ever desired, to understand its properties and potential in ways that filled him with both wonder and dread. He discovered that the dark soul fragments within individual humans were not static but dynamic, capable of growth and evolution, that reflected the experiences and choices of their bearers. This capacity for change was what made humans so adaptable and resilient, but it also meant that their power could theoretically grow without limit given sufficient time and proper conditions. The seals that Gwyn placed upon the Ring Knight's equipment were designed to interrupt this natural process of growth and evolution, channeling the development of their dark soul fragments into predetermined patterns that would serve divine purposes, while preventing the emergence of truly independent power. The knights themselves were not aware of these constraints, experiencing their enhanced abilities as gifts rather than limitations. But the effect was to transform them from humans into something closer to divine servants, bound to their roles as surely as if they had been created specifically for that purpose. To ensure the cooperation of the human rulers who would govern this distant city, Gwyn made a gesture that seemed to demonstrate his good faith and genuine desire for harmony between the divine and human realms. He sent his youngest daughter, Filianore, to dwell in the ringed city as both princess and protector, her presence serving as a living symbol of the bond between gods and mortals, while also fulfilling functions that were far more practical and binding than they appeared. Filianore was perhaps the most gentle and compassionate of Gwyn's children, possessed of a natural empathy that made her genuinely beloved by the human inhabitants of the city. Her willingness to leave the splendor of Londor to dwell among mortals at the world's edge was seen as evidence of divine benevolence, proof that the gods truly cared for humanity's welfare, rather than merely using them for their own purposes. The princess herself embraced her role with the grace and dedication that befitted her divine heritage, finding genuine joy in the opportunity to serve as a bridge between two very different forms of consciousness. But Filianore's true function in the ringed city was more complex and more tragic than either she or her human subjects understood. Her very presence served as a seal, a living barrier that prevented the dark soul fragments within the city's inhabitants from resonating with their counterparts in the broader world. The princess's divine essence created a kind of spiritual isolation that ensured the power of the ringed city's inhabitants would remain contained within the city's boundaries, unable to contribute to the growing network of human consciousness that was developing elsewhere. The seal was not a harsh binding, but something more subtle and insidious. It operated by creating a sense of contentment and fulfillment that made the city's inhabitants genuinely happy with their situation, genuinely grateful for the honor of dwelling in such a magnificent place under the protection of such a benevolent princess. They did not feel imprisoned because they did not desire to leave, did not feel constrained because their lives within the city were rich and meaningful, according to their own understanding of what constituted a good existence. The Pygmy lords who ruled the various districts of the city were themselves unaware of the true nature of their situation. They had been granted impressive titles and significant authority over their subjects, allowed to maintain their own courts and customs, permitted to practice the arts and sciences that interested them without interference from divine oversight. From their perspective, they had achieved everything that humans could reasonably hope for: recognition of their worth, elevation to positions of genuine responsibility, and the opportunity to create communities that reflected their own values and priorities. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent autonomy, the same subtle constraints that governed the Ringed Knights operated to ensure that the Lord's authority remained within acceptable bounds. Their decisions were their own, but the framework within which they made those decisions had been carefully constructed to prevent the emergence of choices that might threaten the larger order. They could innovate and experiment within their domains, but always in ways that served to deepen their connection to the city, rather than creating links to the broader world beyond its boundaries. The dark-infused weapons and armor that were forged within the city represented the highest achievements of human craftsmanship, but they also embodied the fundamental contradiction of the Ringed City's existence. These items were genuinely powerful, genuinely effective, genuinely impressive in their construction and capabilities. They drew upon the properties of the Dark Soul fragments within their creators and wielders, channeling that essence into forms that could affect the physical world in remarkable ways. But every piece of equipment produced within the city bore the subtle marks of divine influence, fire seals that bound their dark nature to patterns that complemented rather than challenged the established order. The weapons could grow stronger through use, could adapt to their wielders' needs, could even develop what seemed like personality and preferences of their own. But they could never evolve in directions that would make them truly independent of the system that had created them, never become tools of genuine rebellion or transformation. The scholars and artificers who worked to create these weapons understood that they were operating under certain constraints, but they interpreted these limitations as challenges to be overcome through cleverness and innovation, rather than as fundamental restrictions on their freedom. They took pride in their ability to work within the established parameters, while still creating items of genuine beauty and utility, seeing themselves as artists who had found ways to express their creativity despite the formal requirements of their medium. This attitude of creative accommodation with authority was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the entire arrangement. The inhabitants of the Ringed City were not rebellious or resentful because they had been given enough genuine autonomy and meaningful work to satisfy their need for purpose and achievement. They collaborated willingly in their own containment, because that containment had been designed to feel like liberation, structured to provide the experience of freedom while preventing the reality of independent action. The furtive Pygmy's response to the creation of the Ringed City revealed the depth of wisdom and patience that had characterized all of the Pygmy's actions since the fragmentation of the Dark Soul. Rather than protesting this elegant imprisonment or attempting to organize resistance to Gwyn's manipulation, the Pygmy quietly accepted the arrangement, while ensuring that its deeper purposes would continue to unfold according to their own internal logic. The Pygmy understood that the Ringed City, despite its function as a prison, also served as a preserve where certain aspects of humanity's true nature could be maintained and developed without interference from the broader pressures that were shaping human society elsewhere. The city's isolation worked both ways. Just as it prevented the inhabitants from influencing the outside world, it also protected them from the various forms of corruption and manipulation that Gwyn was employing in his attempts to control the broader human population. Within the city's rings, human communities could develop according to principles that reflected their connection to the Dark Soul fragments, rather than the divine institutions that were being established elsewhere. Art and learning flourished in forms that drew directly upon the creative potential of darkness, creating works of beauty and insight that would have been impossible under the more restrictive conditions that prevailed in other parts of the realm. The networks of consciousness that connected the city's inhabitants operated with a clarity and intensity that surpassed anything that existed in the outside world. The isolation that prevented these networks from extending beyond the city's boundaries also concentrated them within those boundaries, creating forms of shared awareness and collective intelligence that approached the miraculous in their sophistication and power. These internal developments were subtle enough to escape detection by the divine observers who monitored the city for signs of potential trouble. From the outside, the ringed city appeared to be functioning exactly as Gwyn had intended. Humanity's most powerful representatives were living in honor and comfort while remaining safely isolated from the centers of divine power. The inhabitants seemed genuinely content with their situation, genuinely grateful for the privileges they had been granted, genuinely loyal to the divine order that had created their circumstances. But beneath this surface of satisfied compliance, deeper currents were flowing that would eventually prove far more significant than any form of open resistance could have been. The concentrated development of human potential that the city's isolation made possible was creating new forms of consciousness and capability that operated according to principles that Gwyn had never encountered and could not predict or control. The children born within the ringed city carried dark soul fragments that had been shaped by generations of intensive development within the unique conditions that the city provided. These fragments were more refined, more concentrated, more capable of complex manifestation than anything that existed in the broader human population. The young people who inherited these enhanced fragments possessed abilities that seemed to approach the divine in their scope and subtlety, but remained fundamentally human in their orientation and values. These emerging capabilities remained hidden from divine observation not through deliberate concealment but through their very nature. The powers that were developing within the city operated through cooperation and consensus rather than individual dominance, through integration and harmony rather than conflict and conquest. They created effects that enhanced the city's beauty and prosperity, without obviously challenging the constraints that had been placed upon its inhabitants. The magic that flowed through the city's daily life was not the dramatic sorcery that characterized divine intervention, but something more organic and subtle, more like the natural processes of growth and healing that governed all healthy life. Buildings repaired themselves through the collective will of their inhabitants. Gardens flourished beyond what normal cultivation could achieve, and the very air seemed to carry whispers of shared wisdom and mutual understanding. Princess Filianore, despite her role as an unknowing instrument of her father's policy of containment, found herself genuinely changed by her extended residence among the city's inhabitants. Her divine nature remained intact, but it was gradually being influenced by prolonged exposure to the forms of consciousness and community that the humans had developed within their constrained but creative environment. The princess began to experience forms of awareness and empathy that went beyond anything in her previous divine existence. She could sense the emotions and needs of the city's inhabitants with an immediacy that transcended normal communication, could feel the flow of the collective consciousness that connected all the human souls within the city's boundaries. This growing sensitivity made her a more effective guardian and protector, but it also created bonds of genuine affection and loyalty that went far beyond her original sense of duty. The egg that Filianore carried, the symbol of her role as guardian and seal, began to resonate with the collective essence of the dark soul fragments that surrounded her. This resonance was not a failure of the sealing system, but an intended feature designed to create a stable equilibrium between divine authority and human nature that could be maintained indefinitely. But the actual effect was more complex than Gwyn had anticipated, creating connections and dependencies that would prove far more binding for the divine side of the arrangement than for the human. As the years passed and became decades, As decades accumulated into centuries, the ringed city evolved into something that neither Gwyn nor the furtive Pygmy had originally envisioned. It remained a prison in the sense that its inhabitants could not leave, and their power could not extend beyond its boundaries. But it had also become a laboratory where new forms of consciousness and community were being developed that would eventually prove more significant than any single concentrated power source. The city stood at the world's end, not merely as a place of exile, but as a monument to the patient wisdom of the dark soul's fragmented nature. Here, in this beautiful prison, humanity was discovering forms of existence and cooperation that transcended the limitations that had been placed upon them, while remaining true to the deeper purposes that had guided the furtive Pygmy's original decision to divide power rather than concentrate it. The ringed city would endure through all the ages that followed, its inhabitants growing in wisdom and capability while remaining apparently contained and controlled. When the time finally came for the seals to break, and the true scope of what had been developing within the city's boundaries to be revealed, the results would exceed the worst fears that had originally motivated its creation, while fulfilling the highest hopes that had guided its development from within. But for now, in these golden centuries of the Age of Fire, the city stood as a testament to the complex relationship between divine authority and human potential, between the desire for control and the reality of growth, between the fear of change and the necessity of allowing consciousness to develop according to its own deepest nature. The furtive Pygmy's greatest victory was not in any single act of resistance, but in the patient acceptance of apparent defeat, while ensuring that the seeds of ultimate transformation continued to grow in the darkness between the patient enders. Rings. As the millennia passed and the Age of Fire reached the height of its golden splendor, with Londor gleaming like a jewel in the heavens and the gods ruling over a realm that seemed blessed with eternal prosperity and peace, subtle signs began to appear that the artificial nature of this paradise could not be maintained indefinitely. The first flame, that miraculous source of disparity and light that had made the new world possible, showed the first faint indications of the decline that would eventually threaten everything that had been built upon its foundation. These changes were so gradual, so imperceptible to all but the most sensitive observers, that they might have gone unnoticed for centuries more, if not for the growing desperation that began to manifest in Gwyn's actions and policies. The Lord of Sunlight, whose power was so intimately connected to the flame that he could sense its every fluctuation, felt the weakening of his divine source with an immediacy that filled him with a terror deeper than any he had experienced during the war against the dragons. The flame's decline was not like the dimming of an ordinary fire, which simply grows smaller and weaker until it finally dies. Instead, it was a fundamental alteration in the nature of the force that had created disparity itself, a gradual loss of the essential quality that separated light from darkness, life from death, meaning from emptiness. As the flame weakened, the careful distinctions that had defined the Age of Fire began to blur at their edges, creating instabilities and contradictions that threatened to unravel the entire fabric of ordered existence. Gwyn's response to this crisis was characteristically direct, but also profoundly misguided in its assumptions about the nature of the problem he faced. Rather than accepting that the flame's decline might be a natural process, part of the cosmic cycle that governed all forms of existence, he determined that the solution lay in binding the flame more tightly to sources of power that could sustain it indefinitely. His decision to link his own divine essence to the failing fire represented both the ultimate expression of his dedication to preserving the age he had created and the first step toward a catastrophe that would exceed his worst nightmares. The process of linking the fire required Gwyn to sacrifice not merely his life, but his very nature as an individual consciousness, dissolving his divine essence into the flame itself to serve as fuel for its continued burning. This was not a simple death that would be followed by whatever afterlife awaited divine beings, but a fundamental transformation that would bind his consciousness permanently to the force he sought to preserve, trapping him in an existence that was neither life nor death, but something altogether more terrible. The linking of the fire achieved its immediate goal of restoring the flame's strength and preserving the Age of Fire for another span of centuries. But it also created consequences that Gwyn had not anticipated and could not have foreseen. The binding of divine essence to the flame created a form of artificial stability that was maintained through constant consumption of the very forces it claimed to protect, establishing a cycle of sacrifice and renewal that would demand ever greater offerings to sustain itself. Most significantly, the linking process created an unintended connection between the divine essence that Gwyn had sacrificed and the dark soul fragments that existed within every human being. This connection operated through the fundamental unity that had once existed among all the Lord souls when they were contained within the first flame, but it manifested in ways that revealed the deep incompatibility between concentrated divine power and the distributed nature of humanity's essence. The result of this incompatibility was the emergence of the dark sign, that mysterious mark that would begin to appear on certain humans seemingly at random, but actually following patterns that reflected the deep connections between all fragments of the dark soul. The dark sign was not a curse in the conventional sense, but a symptom of the fundamental disruption that the fire's artificial preservation had created in the natural order of existence. Those humans who bore the dark sign found themselves caught between life and death in ways that defied normal understanding. They could die, experiencing the full reality of death with all its pain and loss of consciousness, but they would inevitably return to a form of life that was not quite the same as what they had lost. Each resurrection left them slightly more hollow, slightly less connected to the full spectrum of human emotion and experience, gradually eroding their essential humanity through the very process that prevented their final extinction. The hollowing process that followed repeated deaths was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire phenomenon. Those affected by the dark sign did not simply lose their lives and return diminished. They lost pieces of themselves with each cycle of death and rebirth, their memories fading, their emotions dulling, their capacity for meaningful connection to others gradually disappearing until nothing remained but the basic animating force that kept their bodies moving through familiar routines. This gradual erosion of consciousness and personality was not random, but followed patterns that reflected the artificial nature of the entire process. The aspects of human nature that were most closely connected to the dark soul fragments, creativity, adaptability, the capacity for growth and change, were the first to fade during hollowing, while the more basic functions that resembled divine patterns of order and stability persisted longest. The result was that hollowed humans became increasingly predictable and controllable, easier to manage, but also fundamentally less human in their essential nature. The establishment of the Way of White as an official religious organization dedicated to combating the undead curse represented Gwyn's attempt to manage the crisis he had inadvertently created, while maintaining the fiction that the curse was an external threat rather than a consequence of his own actions. The Way taught that the undead curse was a test of faith that could be overcome through proper devotion and obedience to divine authority, that the linking of the fire was the highest form of heroism, and that those who bore the dark sign were called to serve the greater good through their sacrifice. This religious framework served multiple purposes beyond simply providing comfort and guidance to those affected by the curse. It created a system for identifying and managing the undead population, ensuring that they would be channeled toward purposes that served divine interests rather than being allowed to develop their own understanding of their condition. It also established the ideological foundation for viewing the undead not as victims of divine policy, but as potential heroes whose suffering had meaning and purpose within the larger cosmic order. The Northern Undead Asylum and similar institutions that were established throughout the realm represented the practical implementation of this religious ideology. These facilities were presented as places of healing and spiritual preparation, where the undead could receive care and guidance while waiting for their destined role in preserving the flame. The reality was more complex and more troubling, as these asylums served primarily as holding facilities that kept the undead population contained and controlled until they were needed for sacrifice. The conditions within these institutions reflected the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Way of White's approach to the undead problem. The inhabitants were treated with a combination of reverence and neglect, honored as future heroes while being denied the basic dignity and agency that such honor should have entailed. They were provided with minimal sustenance and shelter while being subjected to conditions that accelerated their descent into hollowing, creating a population of potential sacrifices who had been systematically stripped of the very qualities that might have made them capable of meaningful choice about their fate. The hollowing process within the asylums followed predictable patterns that revealed the institutional nature of what was supposedly a natural spiritual phenomenon. Those undead who maintained hope, who continued to seek meaning and purpose in their constrained existence, who formed connections with their fellow inmates, tended to resist hollowing longer and more effectively than those who accepted the despair that the asylum environment was designed to foster. This resistance to hollowing through the maintenance of human connections and purposes was seen by the asylum administrators as a problem to be solved rather than a resource to be cultivated. Undead who showed signs of continued spiritual vitality were often separated from others who might be inspired by their example, subjected to additional restrictions and deprivations designed to break down their remaining attachments to their human nature. Yet even within these oppressive conditions, the fundamental nature of the dark soul fragments ensured that complete control was never achieved. Hidden networks of communication and mutual support developed among the asylum populations, operating beneath the notice of their guards and administrators. These networks allowed undead to share information, provide emotional support to each other, and maintain some connection to the human communities and values from which they had been separated. The most remarkable aspect of these hidden support systems was their ability to slow or even reverse the hollowing process in some individuals. Undead who might otherwise have descended into mindless shambling found their consciousness stabilized and even strengthened through participation in these covert communities. They developed forms of resistance to the institutional pressures that sought to reduce them to mere tools of divine will, maintaining their capacity for independent thought and action, even under conditions designed to eliminate such possibilities. These successes in resisting hollowing through human connection and mutual support provided evidence that the curse was not the inevitable spiritual decline that official doctrine claimed it to be. Instead, it appeared to be a form of forced disconnection that could be countered through the deliberate cultivation of the bonds that linked human consciousness to its essential nature and to the broader network of dark soul fragments that connected all humanity. The implications of this discovery were profound but could not be openly discussed within the framework of institutions dedicated to managing the curse rather than curing it. The undead, who developed this understanding, had to maintain their insights in secret, sharing them only with others who could be trusted not to report such dangerous knowledge to the authorities who administered the asylum system. Some of the most insightful among the asylum populations began to understand that their condition was not a random affliction but a direct consequence of the artificial preservation of the Age of Fire through divine sacrifice. They recognized that the dark sign appeared most frequently among humans whose dark soul fragments were most active and developed, suggesting that the curse specifically targeted those aspects of humanity that posed the greatest potential challenge to the established order. This understanding led to the development of alternative approaches to managing the undead condition that focused on strengthening, rather than suppressing the connections between individual consciousness and the larger network of human souls. These approaches could not be practiced openly within the asylum system, but they could be maintained and transmitted through the hidden communities that operated in the margins of official control. The gradual spread of this alternative understanding created a form of resistance that was invisible to the divine authorities who administered the curse management system. On the surface, the asylums continued to function as intended, processing undead populations and preparing them for their eventual sacrifice to maintain the flame. But beneath this surface compliance, a growing number of undead were developing insights and capabilities that would eventually prove far more significant than any form of open rebellion. The furtive Pygmy, though long withdrawn from direct involvement in the affairs of gods and mortals, continued to observe the development of the undead curse with the same patient wisdom that had characterized all of the Pygmy's responses to divine attempts at control. The curse, tragic as it was for the individuals it affected, also represented an opportunity for humanity to develop forms of consciousness and capability that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The undead condition, by placing its sufferers between life and death, created a unique vantage point from which to observe and understand the fundamental forces that governed existence. Those who maintained their sanity and human connections while living with the curse often developed insights into the nature of souls, consciousness, and the relationship between individual and collective identity that exceeded anything achieved by philosophers and scholars working under normal conditions. The networks that connected undead populations within and between different asylums began to serve as repositories for this accumulated wisdom, creating informal schools of thought that developed sophisticated understanding of metaphysical questions that had puzzled thinkers throughout the Age of Fire. These insights could not be recorded in conventional texts or taught through official institutions, but they spread through the hidden channels of communication that the curse management system had been unable to detect or eliminate. The most significant discovery that emerged from these underground schools of undead philosophy was the recognition that the curse was not merely a punishment or test, but a form of forced evolution, an attempt to transform humanity into something more compatible with the artificial nature of the preserved Age of Fire. The hollowing process was designed to strip away the adaptive, creative aspects of human nature while preserving the more controllable, predictable elements that resembled divine patterns of organization. But this process of forced evolution could be resisted and even reversed through the deliberate cultivation of human connections and values, suggesting that consciousness itself was more malleable and resilient than either the gods or most humans had previously understood. The undead who discovered this truth began to see their curse not as a burden to be endured, but as an opportunity to explore the deepest mysteries of existence, while developing capabilities that might eventually transcend the limitations that had been placed upon them. The question of whether the undead curse represented divine wisdom or divine folly remained unresolved within the asylum populations, with different schools of thought developing different interpretations of the phenomenon and its ultimate purpose. Some viewed it as a necessary hardship that would ultimately lead to spiritual growth and transcendence, while others saw it as evidence of the gods' fundamental misunderstanding of human nature and their desperate attempt to solve problems through force rather than wisdom. But regardless of how individual undead interpreted their condition, the experience of living with the curse inevitably led to forms of understanding and capability that exceeded what was possible for normal humans. The constant proximity to death created a clarity of perception that stripped away illusions and pretenses, while the gradual loss of conventional attachments opened space for connections to deeper, more fundamental aspects of existence. The undead who maintained their humanity, while exploring these deeper connections, began to develop abilities that seemed miraculous to outside observers, but were actually natural expressions of consciousness, operating without the usual constraints and limitations. They could perceive the connections between individual souls, could sense the flow of the dark soul fragments through the networks that connected all humanity, could even influence these connections in ways that promoted healing and understanding. These abilities were not supernatural in the sense of violating natural law, but rather represented the full potential of human consciousness, when freed from the artificial constraints that had been placed upon it during the Age of Fire. The curse, despite its tragic effects on individual lives, had inadvertently created conditions that allowed this potential to manifest and develop in ways that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The institutional response to reports of miraculous abilities among certain undead populations was characteristically focused on containment rather than understanding. Rather than investigating these phenomena to determine their nature and implications, the asylum administrators typically responded by increasing restrictions on the individuals involved, seeking to suppress the manifestations rather than learn from them. But suppression of these abilities proved to be as impossible as complete control of the hollowing process had been. Consciousness that had learned to operate without normal limitations could not be easily constrained by conventional means, and the networks that connected undead populations provided channels for sharing knowledge and capabilities that were invisible to traditional forms of surveillance and control. The gradual accumulation of this hidden knowledge and these suppressed capabilities was creating a resource that would eventually prove crucial to humanity's long-term survival and development. The undead populations, despite their apparent weakness and degradation, were actually developing into repositories of wisdom and power that operated according to principles that the gods could not comprehend or effectively counter. The dark sign, that mark of divine failure disguised as a curse upon humanity, was slowly but surely creating exactly the kind of distributed, adaptive, resilient consciousness that the furtive Pygmy had envisioned when first choosing to fragment the dark soul. The curse was teaching humanity to survive under the most extreme conditions, to maintain their essential nature while adapting to circumstances that should have destroyed them, to find strength through connection, even when individual power was stripped away. The Age of Fire, preserved through divine sacrifice and maintained through human suffering, was inadvertently creating the conditions for its own eventual transformation. The very mechanisms that had been designed to ensure its eternal continuation were generating the forces that would ultimately transcend the artificial limitations that had defined its existence from the moment of Gwyn's first, desperate attempt to link the failing flame in the ancient city of Ulasil. Nestled in a valley where the mists still carried whispers of older times, and the boundaries between different ages seemed thinner than elsewhere, scholars and sages pursued their quiet studies of the mysteries that lay hidden beneath the surface of recorded history. This was a place dedicated to learning and contemplation, where the accumulated wisdom of generations was preserved in libraries and archives that rivaled even the grand repositories of Londor in their scope and significance. The people of Ulasil prided themselves on their dedication to knowledge and understanding, their willingness to explore questions that others might consider too dangerous or too complex for mortal minds to comprehend. It was this very dedication to learning, this noble curiosity about the fundamental nature of existence that would lead them to make discoveries that would prove far more catastrophic than any military defeat or natural disaster. The scholars of Ulasil had become fascinated by the earliest period of human history, the time immediately following the fragmentation of the Dark Soul, when humanity first emerged as a distinct race with its own nature and destiny. They sought to understand not just the historical facts of this emergence, but the deeper principles that governed the relationship between consciousness and the dark essence that animated it. Their research led them inevitably to tales and fragments of evidence concerning the primeval man, a figure from the very dawn of humanity, whose grave was said to lie somewhere in the deep places beneath their city. The stories that surrounded this ancient being were contradictory and incomplete, some describing him as the first human to receive a fragment of the Dark Soul, others suggesting that he had been present at the original division and had carried away some special portion of the furtive Pygmy's essence. What all the accounts agreed upon was that this primeval man, known by the name of Manus, possessed a connection to humanity's origins that went deeper than any ordinary individual could claim. The discovery of Manus's actual burial place, deep beneath Ulasil, came after decades of careful excavation and research, guided by textual clues and supported by magical divination that revealed the presence of something extraordinarily powerful slumbering in the darkness below the city's foundations. The tomb itself was a marvel of ancient construction, its walls covered with inscriptions in scripts that predated any known human writing system, its chambers arranged according to geometric principles that seemed to reflect deep understanding of the relationships between physical space and spiritual essence. The scholars who first entered the tomb approached their task with all the reverence and caution that such a momentous discovery deserved. They understood that they were in the presence of something that connected directly to the most fundamental aspects of human nature, something that might hold keys to mysteries that had puzzled philosophers and sages throughout the Age of Fire. Their initial examinations were conducted with meticulous care, every artifact catalogued, every inscription carefully copied and analyzed, every aspect of the burial chamber documented for future study. But even as they worked with such scholarly precision, the investigators began to experience subtle changes in their own consciousness that they initially attributed to the natural excitement of making such an unprecedented discovery. They found their dreams filled with visions of the early days of humanity, when the Dark Soul fragments were first distributed among the hollow beings who would become the human race. They experienced moments of enhanced empathy and connection, feeling as though they could sense the emotions and thoughts of their colleagues with unusual clarity and intensity. These phenomena, rather than alarming the researchers, served only to increase their fascination with their subject. They interpreted the changes they were experiencing as evidence that they were indeed in the presence of something connected to humanity's deepest origins, something that could actually enhance their understanding of their own nature through direct exposure to its influence. The possibility that these changes might represent a form of contamination or corruption rather than enlightenment did not occur to minds trained to seek knowledge wherever it might be found. The decision to disturb Manus's eternal rest was made through a process of collective deliberation that reflected the democratic ideals that characterized Ulasil society. The scholars debated the ethical implications of their proposed action extensively, considering questions about the rights of the dead, the potential risks of awakening forces that had been dormant for millennia, and the responsibility they bore to humanity as a whole to unlock whatever secrets the primeval man might possess. In the end, their curiosity and their genuine desire to advance human understanding overcame their caution. They convinced themselves that the knowledge they might gain would justify whatever risks they might be taking, that their careful scholarly approach would allow them to manage any dangers that might arise from their investigation. They saw themselves as pioneers of understanding, brave explorers of territories of knowledge that had never before been mapped by mortal minds. The awakening of Manus was not the gentle restoration to consciousness that the scholars had hoped for, but a violent eruption of awareness that had been driven to madness by the sudden transition from peaceful death to chaotic life. The primeval man did not return to the world as he had left it, but as something transformed by eons of dreamless sleep, his consciousness shattered by the abrupt severing of whatever peace he had found in death. The dark soul fragment within him, freed from the constraints of peaceful slumber, exploded outward with a fury that reflected not just his individual anguish, but the accumulated suffering of all humanity since the first linking of the fire. The transformation of Manus into the Father of the Abyss was perhaps the most catastrophic event in the history of the Age of Fire, surpassing even the Witch of Izalith's creation of the Chaos Flame in its implications for the future of existence itself. Where the Chaos Flame had simply introduced new forms of destruction and transformation into the world, the Abyss represented something far more fundamental and threatening, the complete negation of the ordered reality that the Age of Fire had sought to establish. The power that flowed from the maddened Manus was darkness given malicious intent, a force that sought not merely to change or transform what it encountered, but to unmake it entirely, to reduce the carefully constructed structures of meaning and purpose that defined civilized existence to their component elements, and then scatter those elements into nothingness. The Abyss was not satisfied with conquest or conversion. It demanded the complete elimination of everything that represented order, growth, beauty, or hope. Ulasil, that center of learning and wisdom, became the first victim of this unprecedented horror. The city's inhabitants found themselves transformed by the Abyss's influence in ways that were far more terrible than the physical mutations that had characterized the Chaos Flame's effects. Where the demons born from chaos retained at least some recognizable form and purpose, the creatures spawned by the Abyss were nightmares of pure malice, beings whose very existence violated the fundamental principles that made life meaningful or bearable. The scholars who had initiated the catastrophe through their well-intentioned research suffered fates that were perhaps the most tragic of all. Their vast knowledge and refined understanding became tools of madness rather than instruments of wisdom. Their capacity for deep thought and careful analysis transformed into engines for generating ever more sophisticated forms of despair and destruction. They retained enough of their original consciousness to understand what they had become and what they had caused, but they lacked any power to resist or reverse the transformation that was consuming them. The spread of the Abyss from Ulasil created ripples of corruption that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the city itself. The very ground became tainted with a darkness that was actively hostile to normal forms of life, transforming familiar landscapes into alien territories where the laws of nature operated according to principles of pure malevolence. Plants twisted into forms that hurt the eye to look upon. Water became thick with substances that poisoned both body and spirit, and the air itself seemed to whisper with voices that spoke only of despair and futility. The creatures that emerged from these corrupted lands were not merely dangerous, but fundamentally wrong in ways that challenged the sanity of those who encountered them. They moved according to logics that defied understanding, attacked without apparent motivation or strategy, and seemed to exist solely for the purpose of spreading the same wrongness that had created them. They were not alive in any meaningful sense, but neither were they dead. They occupied a liminal space between existence and non-existence that made them impossible to comprehend or effectively combat. News of the disaster at Ulasil reached Anor Londo through magical communications and the reports of refugees who had fled the spreading corruption, but the initial accounts were so extreme and so unprecedented that many divine observers dismissed them as exaggerations born from panic and confusion. The gods had become accustomed to thinking of threats in terms of opposing forces that could be understood and countered through superior power or better strategy. But the Abyss operated according to principles that made conventional responses not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. The realization that they were facing something that could not be defeated through normal means forced the divine authorities to confront fundamental questions about the nature of reality and their own ability to maintain the order they had established. If the Abyss could transform the accumulated wisdom of Ulasil into an instrument of destruction, if it could corrupt the very ground and air into agents of chaos, then what hope was there that any place or any being would prove immune to its influence? Among Gwyn's 4 knights, it was Artorias who first volunteered to investigate the growing crisis and, if possible, take action to contain the threat before it could spread to other population centers. The Abyss Walker, as he had come to be known through his previous encounters with dark forces, possessed both the courage and the capabilities that such a mission would require. His great sword and his loyal wolf companion Sif were symbols of hope throughout the realm, and his very name had become synonymous with the triumph of noble purpose over malevolent opposition. But Artorias approached this new challenge with a clear understanding that it represented something fundamentally different from the threats he had faced in the past. The Abyss was not simply a powerful enemy that could be overcome through superior skill and determination, but a force that attacked the very foundations of identity and meaning that made heroism possible. It sought not just to defeat its opponents, but to transform them into extensions of its own malevolent purpose. To protect himself from the Abyss's corrupting influence while still being able to enter the tainted lands and engage with its manifestations directly, Artorias forged a covenant with the very forces he sought to destroy. The ring that symbolized this agreement granted him the ability to traverse the Abyss without being immediately overwhelmed by its influence, but it also created a connection between his own essence and the power of negation and despair that defined the corrupted realm. This covenant represented perhaps the greatest act of heroic sacrifice in the history of the Age of Fire, for Artorias understood that by accepting this connection to the Abyss, he was placing his own soul at risk in ways that went far beyond the possibility of physical death. He was gambling his essential nature, his identity as a force for good and order, on his ability to maintain his moral center while walking through realms where morality itself was under constant assault. Accompanied by Sif, whose loyalty had never wavered through all their adventures together, Artorias descended into the corrupted depths of what had once been Ulasil. The city they found there bore no resemblance to the center of learning and culture that it had been before the awakening of Manus. The buildings had been twisted into impossible configurations that hurt the mind to contemplate, their familiar architecture transformed into monuments to meaninglessness and despair. The inhabitants they encountered were no longer human in any recognizable sense, their forms and consciousness corrupted by prolonged exposure to the Abyss's influence. Some had become creatures of pure aggression, attacking anything that moved with a fury that seemed to draw from sources deeper than individual anger or pain. Others had been reduced to states of catatonic despair, their minds broken by visions of ultimate futility that made any form of action or hope seem pointless. The battle that Artorias fought in the depths of the Abyss was unlike any conflict that had ever been witnessed during the Age of Fire. It was not merely a contest of strength or skill, but a struggle for the very nature of reality itself, a confrontation between the principles of meaning and purpose that defined heroic action, and the forces of negation that sought to reduce all such principles to empty illusions. Every step forward required not just physical courage but spiritual fortitude, the ability to maintain faith in the value of his mission, while surrounded by evidence that all efforts to create good or beauty were ultimately doomed to failure. The abyss attacked not just through its monstrous manifestations, but through the whispers of despair that it planted in the minds of those who dared to oppose it. Voices that spoke with perfect logic about the futility of resistance and the inevitable triumph of entropy over order. For a time, it seemed as though Artorias might succeed where all others had failed. His great sword carved through the creatures of the abyss like lightning through storm clouds, and his presence seemed to create pockets of stability and hope in the midst of the surrounding chaos. Sif fought beside him with the fierce loyalty that had always characterized their partnership, her fangs and claws proving effective even against enemies that seemed to exist only partially in the physical realm. But the abyss was patient in its malice, and it understood that even the greatest heroes had limits to their endurance and resistance. The constant exposure to its corrupting influence began to take its toll on Artorias, wearing away at his mental and spiritual defenses like water slowly eroding stone. The ring that allowed him to traverse the abyss also created a conduit through which its poison could seep into his soul, gradually undermining the very foundations of his heroic nature. The transformation of Artorias from champion of light to corrupted servant of darkness was perhaps the greatest tragedy of the entire Age of Fire, representing the failure not just of individual heroism, but of the entire system of values and beliefs that had sustained divine civilization since its founding. His corruption was not the result of moral weakness or failure of will, but the inevitable consequence of prolonged exposure to forces that operated beyond the boundaries of normal good and evil. As the abyss's influence grew stronger within him, Artorias found his perceptions increasingly distorted, his ability to distinguish between friend and enemy compromised by visions that showed him terrible truths about the nature of reality and his own place within it. The noble purposes that had driven him to undertake his mission began to seem naive and meaningless when viewed from the perspective that the abyss provided, and his commitment to protecting the innocent was gradually replaced by a growing conviction that innocence itself was an illusion that caused more suffering than it prevented. Recognizing that his corruption was advancing beyond his ability to control, and understanding that his continued presence in the abyss would eventually transform him into one of the very evils he had sought to destroy, Artorias made one final gesture of heroic self-sacrifice. Using the last remnants of his uncorrupted will, he cast a protective barrier around Sif, ensuring that his loyal companion would survive, even if he himself fell completely to the darkness that was consuming him. This act of selfless love was perhaps the most heroic thing Artorias had ever done, a moment of pure light shining through the encroaching shadow of his transformation. It demonstrated that even as the abyss corrupted his mind and twisted his purposes, the fundamental core of his character remained intact enough to choose protection for another over-preservation of himself. The barrier he created was not just a magical shield, but a manifestation of the love and loyalty that had always defined their relationship. The fall of Artorias represented more than just the loss of a great hero. It symbolized the fundamental inadequacy of traditional approaches to the new forms of evil that were emerging as the Age of Fire continued its artificial preservation. The corruption that claimed him was not something that could be defeated through superior force or greater dedication, but a systemic problem that arose from the very nature of the world that divine intervention had created and maintained. Yet even as Artorias succumbed to the abyss's influence, becoming a twisted shadow of his former self, the legend of his heroism began to grow in the outside world. The full truth of what had happened in the depths of Ulasile was known to very few, and those few had compelling reasons to keep the details of the knight's fate hidden from public knowledge. Instead, Stories began to spread of Artorias, the Abyss Walker's great victory over the forces of darkness, tales that painted him as the savior who had single-handedly defeated Manus and saved the world from the encroaching shadow. These legends, though false in their specific details, served important functions in maintaining the stability and morale of the divine order during a time of unprecedented crisis. They provided hope to those who were struggling against their own encounters with dark forces, proof that evil could be overcome through sufficient courage and determination. They reinforced the authority of the gods by demonstrating that their champions were capable of achieving impossible victories against overwhelming odds. Most importantly, these fabricated stories of triumph obscured the troubling truth that the Age of Fire's greatest defender had been corrupted by the very forces he had sworn to destroy, preventing the kind of despair and loss of faith that might have led to widespread rebellion or collapse of the social order. The maintenance of this fiction required active cooperation from those who knew the truth, creating a conspiracy of silence that protected the stability of the realm, at the cost of honest understanding of the challenges it faced. The corruption of Ulasil and the fall of Artorias marked a turning point in the long decline of the Age of Fire, the moment when it became clear that the artificial preservation of the flame through divine sacrifice was creating problems that could not be solved through conventional means. The Abyss represented the dark reflection of humanity's fragmented soul, showing what happened when the adaptability and resilience that were the Dark Soul's greatest strengths were stripped of the wisdom and connection that gave them meaning and direction. The tragedy of Manus was not just that he had been transformed into an agent of destruction, but that his transformation revealed the potential for similar corruption within every human being who carried a fragment of the Dark Soul. The Abyss had shown that the same forces that made humanity resilient and creative could also make them vulnerable to forms of madness and despair that transcended individual psychology and became cosmic threats to the ordered nature of existence itself. The lesson that the divine authorities drew from this catastrophe was characteristically focused on control rather than understanding. Rather than investigating the deeper causes that had made Manus vulnerable to such extreme corruption, or exploring ways to strengthen the connections between dark soul fragments and the wisdom that could guide their development, the response was to increase restrictions on human activities and tighten surveillance of human communities for signs of similar dangers. But the true lesson of Ulasil's fall was more complex and more hopeful than the divine authorities were able to perceive. The corruption of Manus had been possible precisely because he had been isolated from the networks of human connection and mutual support that the furtive Pygmy's original fragmentation of the Dark Soul was meant to create. His slumber in the depths had severed him from the collective wisdom and shared experience that might have provided him with resources for maintaining his sanity and humanity when awakened to a transformed world. The Abyss, for all its terrifying power, there was not an inevitable expression of the Dark Soul's nature, but a distortion created by the separation of individual fragments from the larger network that gave them meaning and direction. The horror of what had emerged from Manus's awakening served as a warning about the importance of maintaining the connections between all who carried the Dark Soul's essence, a reminder that isolation and separation were the greatest threats to humanity's long-term survival and development. In the hidden networks that connected the undead populations throughout the realm, this understanding began to spread in forms that could not be detected or suppressed by the institutional systems designed to manage and control human development. The fall of Artorias and the corruption of Ulasil became cautionary tales that taught the importance of community, mutual support, and the careful cultivation of wisdom alongside power. These lessons would prove crucial when the time finally came for humanity to assert its true nature and transcend the limitations that had been placed upon its development. As the centuries accumulated into millennia and the artificial preservation of the Age of Fire continued through repeated cycles of linking and renewal. The pattern that had begun with Gwyn's original sacrifice evolved into an increasingly desperate and costly system that demanded ever greater offerings to sustain its failing mechanisms. Each time the first flame began to fade, as it inevitably did despite whatever divine essence had been fed to its hunger, new heroes would emerge, or be chosen to make the ultimate sacrifice, casting themselves into the dying fire to purchase another few centuries of artificial stability. These Lords of Cinder, as they came to be known, represented the finest aspects of their respective ages, individuals whose power and dedication made them capable of sustaining the flame's demands, while their sacrifice provided the divine essence necessary to postpone the natural end of the Age of Fire. But each linking brought diminishing returns, shorter periods of stability, and increasingly catastrophic side effects that reflected the growing strain that the artificial preservation was placing upon the fundamental structures of reality itself. The relationship between these Lords of Cinder and humanity was complex and often troubled, reflecting the deep tensions that had characterized divine-human interactions since the earliest days of the current age. Some lords were themselves human, elevated to positions of power and responsibility that prepared them for their ultimate sacrifice, while demonstrating humanity's capacity for greatness when properly guided and supported. Others were divine beings or creatures from different traditions entirely, but all found their fates intertwined with humanity's development in ways that revealed the central role that the Dark Soul continued to play in the cosmic order. The Abyss Watchers represented perhaps the most tragic example of how good intentions and noble purposes could be corrupted by the very forces they sought to oppose. These warriors had been inspired by the legend of Artorias, modeling themselves on the heroic ideal that his fabricated story represented while remaining unaware of the true circumstances that had led to his fall. They bound themselves together with wolf's blood, creating a collective identity that was supposed to make them stronger and more resilient than any individual fighter could be. Their mission was to prevent the spread of the abyss wherever it might manifest, to serve as an early warning system and first line of defense against the kind of corruption that had consumed Ulasil and transformed its inhabitants into agents of pure malice. They established themselves in Farron Keep, a fortress sanctuary where they could monitor the world for signs of abyssal influence while maintaining their readiness to respond to any threat that might emerge. For generations, the Abyss Watchers fulfilled their purpose with dedication and effectiveness that earned them respect throughout the realm. They developed techniques for detecting and combating abyssal corruption that surpassed anything that had been available to previous heroes, learned to work together in ways that amplified their individual capabilities while protecting them from the isolation that had made Manus and Artorias vulnerable to the darkness they fought. But their collective binding, which had been designed as a source of strength, ultimately became the mechanism of their downfall. When corruption finally touched one of their number, spreading through their shared blood like a disease through a connected organism, the entire organization was compromised simultaneously. They retained their skills and their dedication, but their understanding of friend and enemy became hopelessly confused, leading them to fight endless battles against each other in the ruins of their own sanctuary. The poison swamps that surrounded their fortress became monuments to their failure, toxic waters that reflected the corruption of their original purpose, while serving as barriers that prevented their madness from spreading to the outside world. The Abyss Watchers continued their eternal battle in this poisoned landscape, neither fully alive nor properly dead. Their noble sacrifice transformed into a meaningless repetition of violence that served no purpose beyond its own continuation. Aldrich, Saint of the Deep, embodied a different kind of tragedy, one that revealed how even the most genuine compassion and desire to help others could be twisted into something monstrous when stripped of the wisdom and restraint that should guide such impulses. He had begun his career as a genuine holy man, dedicated to feeding the hungry and comforting the afflicted with a sincerity and effectiveness that earned him widespread veneration throughout the communities he served. His sainthood was not a political appointment or inherited title, but a recognition that emerged naturally from the gratitude and love of those whose lives he had touched. Aldrich possessed a rare combination of practical competence and spiritual insight that allowed him to address both the immediate physical needs and the deeper existential hungers of those who sought his aid. His followers were not drawn by promises of power or visions of conquest, but by the simple experience of being genuinely cared for by someone who understood their suffering. But Aldrich's understanding of love and care gradually evolved in directions that reflected the distortions that characterized all aspects of existence during the later phases of the Age of Fire's artificial preservation. He began to see the suffering that he was constantly called upon to address not as a series of separate problems that could be solved through individual interventions, but as symptoms of a deeper cosmic tragedy that required more radical solutions. His developing theology taught that the ultimate expression of love was to preserve those he cherished by literally incorporating their essence into his own being, creating a form of union that would protect them from the pain and uncertainty of independent existence, while allowing them to contribute to his growing power to help others. This doctrine of loving consumption was not presented as conquest or domination, but as the highest form of spiritual intimacy, a gift that he offered to those who had earned his particular affection. The deep that Aldrich came to represent was not the chaotic malice of the abyss, but something more insidious and harder to recognize as evil. Order taken to such extremes that it became indistinguishable from tyranny. Love expressed through such total possession that it destroyed the very qualities that had made its objects worthy of love in the first place. His followers submitted to consumption not through coercion but through genuine belief that they were participating in something sacred and beneficial. When the time came for Aldrich to link the fire, his sacrifice was motivated not by abstract duty or divine compulsion, but by his sincere conviction that feeding himself to the flame would allow him to extend his protective care to all of existence, creating a cosmic order where suffering would be impossible, because all consciousness would be unified within his benevolent control. His linking was perhaps the most willing and enthusiastic of any Lord of Cinder, undertaken with joy rather than resignation. But the preservation of consciousness within the flame that Aldrich's linking achieved was not the peaceful unity he had envisioned, but a nightmare of eternal absorption, where individual identity was maintained just enough to experience the horror of being digested by forces far beyond any single being's capacity to contain or direct. His dreams of universal love became visions of universal consumption. His desire to protect others transformed into an endless hunger that could never be satisfied regardless of how much it devoured. Yhorm the giant represented yet another form of tragedy, one that revealed the terrible irony of power exercised out of love, but without sufficient understanding of the consequences that such power would inevitably produce. As the lord of the profaned capital, Yhorm had ruled over a diverse population that included both giants and humans, maintaining a delicate balance between different groups whose needs and natures were often in conflict with each other. His love for his subjects was genuine and deep, expressed not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the patient, careful attention to the countless small decisions that determined whether a kingdom would be a place where its inhabitants could flourish or merely survive. Yhorm understood that true leadership meant taking responsibility for the welfare of those who had no choice but to trust in his wisdom and competence, and he approached this responsibility with the gravity and dedication it deserved. When the flame began to fade during his reign, threatening to plunge his kingdom into the chaos and suffering that characterized the dark periods between linkings, Yhorm faced the choice that had confronted every ruler during the previous cycles of renewal. He could allow nature to take its course, accepting that his subjects would suffer through the transition to whatever age might follow, or he could make the ultimate sacrifice to preserve the order and stability they depended upon. His decision to link the fire was motivated not by personal ambition or divine compulsion, but by simple love for people who would bear the consequences of whatever choice he made. He could not bear the thought of the chaos and destruction that would accompany the flame's natural death, could not accept that his subjects' only crime had been trusting in his protection while forces beyond any individual's control determined their fate. But the linking process that Yhorm underwent produced results that were the exact opposite of what his love and sacrifice were meant to achieve. Instead of preserving his kingdom and protecting his people, the divine fire that he fed with his essence turned upon the very beings he had sought to save, consuming them in flames that burned with the concentrated fury of a god's love perverted into an instrument of destruction. The profaned capital became a monument to the bitter irony that good intentions, no matter how pure or selfless, could not overcome the fundamental contradictions built into a system that preserved order through the violation of natural law. The city's architecture was twisted by the same flames that were supposed to protect it, its streets filled, not with the grateful citizens Yhorm had died to save, but with the charred remnants of lives that had been sacrificed to sustain an age that could no longer justify its own continuation. Yhorm's resurrection as a Lord of Cinder forced him to confront the full magnitude of what his sacrifice had achieved, to exist in a world where everyone he had loved was dead, and where his continued existence served only to maintain the system that had made their deaths inevitable. His withdrawal into isolation within the ruins of his capital was not cowardice, but a form of moral paralysis, the natural response of a conscience confronted with the knowledge that every action taken in service of the established order would only perpetuate the cycle of well-intentioned destruction. The pattern that these Lords of Cinder represented was not one of simple moral failure or personal weakness, but of systemic corruption that transformed virtue into vice, love into destruction, wisdom into folly. Each of them had been shaped by the conditions that characterized the later phases of the Age of Fire's preservation, when the artificial nature of the cosmic order had become so pronounced that even the most noble intentions inevitably produced consequences that contradicted their original purposes. The undead curse that affected increasing numbers of humans during these cycles reflected the same pattern of systematic distortion that had corrupted the Lords of Cinder. Where previous generations of undead had experienced their condition as a tragic affliction that could be borne with dignity and perhaps even transcended through spiritual development, later undead found themselves trapped in forms of existence that made growth, learning, and meaningful connection increasingly difficult to achieve or maintain. The hollowing process that had once been a gradual decline that could be resisted through community and purpose became an accelerating cascade that stripped away identity and consciousness with ruthless efficiency. The networks of hidden understanding that had sustained earlier undead communities became harder to maintain as the curse's effects grew more severe and its victims more numerous than the existing support systems could accommodate. Yet even under these increasingly harsh conditions, the fundamental resilience that characterized the Dark Soul's fragmented nature ensured that some forms of resistance and adaptation would continue to emerge. Human communities learned to develop new strategies for maintaining their essential nature while accommodating the various supernatural pressures that threatened to overwhelm them. creating forms of social organization and cultural practice that drew upon the deepest resources of their shared heritage. The most successful of these adaptive strategies involved the cultivation of networks that operated not just between living humans, but across the boundaries that separated life from death, sanity from madness, individual consciousness from collective awareness. These networks allowed communities to maintain continuity and purpose even when their individual members were subject to transformations that would have destroyed more conventional forms of social organization. The knowledge and capabilities that developed within these hidden networks began to approach levels that surpassed anything that had been achieved during the earlier, supposedly more stable periods of the Age of Fire. Humans learned to work directly with the forces that governed souls and consciousness, to navigate the complex relationships between different states of existence, to maintain their essential humanity while adapting to conditions that challenged every assumption about what human nature could encompass. These developments remained largely invisible to the divine authorities who continued to govern the official structures of society, but their effects became increasingly apparent in the emergence of individuals and groups whose capabilities seemed to exceed anything that conventional understanding of human limitations would suggest was possible. The undead, who had been expected to serve as passive fuel for the flame's continuation, began to demonstrate forms of agency and wisdom that challenged the assumptions upon which the entire cycle of renewal was based. The most significant of these challenges emerged in the form of organized resistance movements that drew their membership not from the politically ambitious or the conventionally powerful, but from those who had been most thoroughly marginalized by the existing order: the undead, the hollow, the forgotten, and the despised. These groups understood from direct experience that the system of cyclic renewal was not a natural law that had to be accepted, but an artificial construction that could be challenged and potentially transformed. Their resistance was not characterized by the dramatic gestures and public declarations that marked conventional political movements, but by patient work to create alternative structures that could provide the benefits that the official system claimed to offer, while avoiding the costs and contradictions that made those benefits ultimately unsustainable. They developed new approaches to governance, new forms of community organization, new methods for addressing the spiritual and practical needs that the existing order had proven unable to meet. The success of these alternative approaches was measured not in terms of territory conquered or enemies defeated, but in the gradual spread of forms of consciousness and community that were more resilient, more adaptive, and more genuinely supportive of human flourishing than anything that the Age of Fire had produced during its centuries of artificial preservation. These successes remained largely invisible to outside observers, but they created the foundation for transformations that would eventually prove more significant than any military victory or political revolution. The Lords of Cinder, who refused to return to their thrones when the bell tolled to summon them, were not acting out of simple selfishness or cowardice, but from hard-won understanding of what their previous sacrifice had actually accomplished, and what their renewed participation in the cycle would inevitably produce. They had seen the results of their well-intentioned efforts to preserve the Age of Fire, had lived with the knowledge of what their love and dedication had been transformed into by forces beyond their control or comprehension. Their refusal represented a form of wisdom that transcended individual self-preservation, a recognition that the system they were being called to perpetuate was fundamentally flawed and could not be reformed through more heroic sacrifice or more dedicated service. They understood that the only way to break the cycle of well-intentioned destruction was to refuse to participate in it, even at the cost of allowing the artificial order they had once served to collapse under its own contradictions. This collective refusal created a crisis that exceeded anything the Age of Fire had faced since its original establishment, forcing its remaining defenders to confront the possibility that the system they had spent millennia perfecting might be inherently unsustainable. The emergency measures that were implemented to address this crisis would reveal both the desperation of those who sought to maintain the existing order and the emerging power of those who had learned to envision alternatives to it. The awakening of the unkindled, those who had previously failed in their attempts to link the fire, represented both an act of desperation and an acknowledgement that the conventional sources of heroic sacrifice had been exhausted. These were individuals who had proven their dedication through their willingness to attempt the ultimate sacrifice, but whose failure had preserved them from the consumption that success would have entailed, leaving them available as resources for this final crisis. But the unkindled who emerged from this resurrection were not the same beings who had originally failed in their attempts to link the fire. Their experience of failure, of falling short of the ultimate heroic ideal, had given them perspectives and insights that success would never have provided. They understood the cost of the system they were being asked to preserve in ways that previous heroes had not, and their response to the choices they faced would reflect this deeper understanding of what was truly at stake in the struggle between artificial preservation and natural transformation. Yet even as the conventional mechanisms for maintaining the Age of Fire began to reveal their ultimate inadequacy, new forms of resistance and alternative vision were emerging from the very communities that had been most thoroughly oppressed by the Divine Order. In the hidden kingdom of Londor, built in the shadows and spaces that existed between the officially recognized territories of the realm, the descendants of the furtive Pygmy's legacy had spent centuries developing approaches to the problems of existence that transcended the ancient dichotomy between fire and darkness. Londor was not a kingdom in any conventional sense, with clear borders and established capitals and the usual apparatus of royal authority. Instead, it was a network of communities and individuals who shared a common understanding of humanity's true nature and destiny, connected by bonds that operated beneath the surface of official society, while maintaining their independence from the cycles of sacrifice and renewal that had trapped so much of the world in patterns of endless repetition. The founding of the Sable Church represented the culmination of centuries of patient work to create institutional structures that could serve humanity's deepest needs while remaining invisible to the divine authorities who might seek to suppress or co-opt such developments. This was not a church in the sense of a traditional religious organization, with hierarchies and doctrines imposed from above, but something more organic and responsive, a spiritual community that emerged naturally from the shared experiences and insights of those who had learned to navigate existence while carrying the burden of the undead curse. The three sisters who provided leadership for the Sable Church, Yuria, Lilian, and their mysterious third companion embodied different aspects of the wisdom that humanity had accumulated through its long struggle with the constraints and distortions of the Age of Fire. They were not rulers who commanded through authority or divine mandate, but teachers and guides who helped others discover the capabilities and understanding that already existed within their own dark soul fragments. Yuria, perhaps the most visible of the three, had mastered the art of maintaining human consciousness and connection, even under the most extreme conditions of hollowing and despair. Her techniques for resisting the erosion of identity that characterized the undead curse drew upon resources that went far deeper than individual willpower or religious faith, tapping into the collective strength of the dark soul fragments and the networks that connected all who carried them. Her understanding of the curse was fundamentally different from the official doctrine promoted by the Way of White and similar institutions, where they taught that the dark sign was a mark of divine testing or punishment that could be overcome through proper submission to divine authority. Yuria saw it as evidence of humanity's fundamental incompatibility with the artificial order that the gods had imposed upon the natural progression of ages. The art of life drain that Yuria and her followers practiced was not the crude consumption that characterized creatures like Aldrich, but a sophisticated understanding of how consciousness and essence could be shared and redistributed in ways that strengthened the collective while preserving the individuality of all participants. This was not taking life from others to enhance oneself, but learning to participate in the deeper currents of vitality that connected all fragments of the dark soul. Through life drain, the practitioners of the Sable Church's teachings could absorb not just the physical essence that sustained life, but the accumulated wisdom and experience of others, creating a form of collective learning that allowed each individual to benefit from insights that might have taken lifetimes to develop through personal experience alone. This was not domination, but cooperation at the deepest possible level, sharing that enhanced rather than diminished all who participated in it. The practice required tremendous discipline and spiritual development to master safely, for the temptation to use such power for personal advantage rather than collective benefit was always present. Those who approached life drain with selfish motives or inadequate preparation typically found themselves consumed by the very forces they sought to control, their consciousness scattered, and their humanity lost in ways that made ordinary hollowing seem gentle by comparison. But those who mastered the art through proper understanding and motivation found that it opened doorways to forms of existence and capability that transcended the limitations that had been placed upon human development since the earliest days of the current age. They could share memories and experiences directly, could maintain consciousness across multiple deaths and rebirths, could even extend their awareness beyond the boundaries of individual identity, while preserving the unique perspectives that made them valuable contributors to the collective understanding. The hollow wedding ceremony that represented the ultimate expression of the Sable Church's alternative approach to human relationships and spiritual development was perhaps the most profound innovation to emerge from their centuries of patient experimentation. This ritual created bonds between individuals that operated according to principles entirely different from those that governed conventional marriage or friendship, establishing connections that could survive death, transformation, and even the complete hollowing of one or both participants. The ceremony itself was conducted in the deepest chambers beneath Londor, where the influence of the dark soul fragments was strongest and the interference from divine institutions was minimal. The participants approached the ritual not as individuals seeking personal fulfillment, but as representatives of the larger human community, understanding that their union would serve to strengthen the networks that connected all who carried fragments of the dark soul. The vows exchanged during these ceremonies were not promises to love and cherish in the conventional sense, but commitments to maintain connection and mutual support, regardless of what transformations or challenges might lie ahead. The couples who emerged from hollow weddings were bound not just to each other, but to the larger purpose of preserving and developing humanity's true nature, in defiance of all attempts to suppress or pervert it. These unions produced children whose dark soul fragments were somehow both more concentrated and more connected than those of previous generations, carrying within them the accumulated wisdom and capability of parents who had learned to transcend the artificial limitations imposed by the dying age. These young people represented something genuinely new in the history of humanity. Beings who were fully human, but also something more, connected to their heritage while pointing toward possibilities that had never before been explored. The plan that emerged from the Sable Church's understanding of humanity's situation was elegantly simple in its conception, but profoundly radical in its implications. Rather than accepting the choice between linking the fire to preserve an artificial age or allowing it to die and usher in an unknown darkness, they proposed a third alternative: the usurpation of the fire itself, the transformation of the cosmic order from within, rather than its destruction or preservation in unchanged form. This usurpation would not be accomplished through conquest or force, but through the patient cultivation of understanding and capability that would allow humanity to take responsibility for the fundamental forces that governed existence, rather than remaining subject to them. The Lord of Hollows, who would emerge from this process, would not be a ruler in the conventional sense, but a focal point through which the collective wisdom and power of humanity could express itself in forms capable of reshaping reality, according to principles of genuine justice and sustainable harmony. The preparation for this usurpation required forms of spiritual and practical development that went far beyond anything that had been attempted during previous cycles of the Age of Fire. Participants in the Sable Church's program underwent training that integrated physical combat skills with metaphysical understanding, learning to work with the deepest properties of souls and consciousness, while maintaining their connection to the practical needs of human communities. This training drew upon knowledge that had been preserved in the hidden networks that connected human communities across time and space, insights that had been accumulated through centuries of resistance to the various forms of oppression that had characterized divine rule. The techniques they learned were not just tools for personal advancement, but methods for strengthening the collective capabilities of humanity as a whole. The most advanced practitioners of these methods began to develop abilities that seemed to approach the divine in their scope and subtlety, but remained fundamentally human in their orientation and values. They could manipulate the flow of souls and consciousness with precision that exceeded anything achieved by conventional magic, but they used these capabilities in service of human flourishing rather than personal aggrandizement or abstract ideological goals. The network of agents and allies that the Sable Church developed throughout the official structures of society demonstrated the sophistication and far-reaching nature of their planning. These were not revolutionaries seeking to overthrow the existing order through violence, but reformers working to transform it from within through patient influence and the gradual spread of alternative understanding. Their success in placing sympathetic individuals within key positions of authority throughout the realm allowed them to influence policy and practice in ways that served human interests, while remaining largely invisible to those who might seek to suppress such influence. They could protect vulnerable communities from the worst excesses of divine policy, could ensure that resources reached those who needed them most, could create spaces where alternative approaches to governance and spiritual development could be explored and refined. The ultimate goal of this patient infiltration was not to seize control of the existing system, but to create conditions where humanity could transcend the need for such systems entirely. They understood that true freedom could not be achieved through the conquest of oppressive institutions, but only through the development of forms of consciousness and community that made such institutions irrelevant to human flourishing. The Lord of Hollows ending that the Sable Church worked to bring about represented not just a change in cosmic authority, but a fundamental transformation in the nature of power itself. Instead of the concentrated, hierarchical authority that had characterized divine rule, this new order would be based on distributed consciousness and collective decision-making that drew upon the wisdom and experience of all who participated in it. The Hollows, who would serve as the foundation for this new order, were not the mindless shells that conventional understanding portrayed them as, but beings who had learned to exist without the artificial supports and constraints that characterized normal consciousness during the Age of Fire. Their apparent emptiness was actually a form of openness, a receptivity to forms of connection and understanding that remained impossible for those who clung to rigid definitions of individual identity. The transformation of hollowing from a curse to be feared into a spiritual discipline to be cultivated represented one of the most significant developments in human consciousness since the original fragmentation of the Dark Soul. Those who mastered this transformation discovered that the apparent loss of individual identity that characterized advanced hollowing could become a doorway to participation in collective consciousness that preserved and enhanced rather than diminishing their essential humanity. The Sable Church's success in developing these alternative approaches to existence and governance created a foundation for possibilities that extended far beyond the immediate crisis of the failing flame. They demonstrated that the ancient choice between fire and darkness was not the only option available to conscious beings, that new forms of reality could be created through the patient application of wisdom and cooperation, rather than the dramatic gestures of individual heroism that had characterized previous attempts at cosmic transformation. But their work also revealed the continuing relevance of the Furtive Pygmy's original vision, the wisdom embedded in the decision to fragment the dark soul rather than keeping it concentrated in a single individual. The distributed nature of human consciousness that this fragmentation had created was proving to be the key to transcending all the limitations that had trapped previous ages in cycles of rise and decline, preservation and destruction, order and chaos. In the shadows that existed between the official territories of the dying Age of Fire, where forgotten souls gathered and unwanted beings found refuge from the harsh judgments of a world that had no place for them, there stood a realm that defied easy categorization or understanding. The painted world of Ariamis was not a kingdom or domain in any conventional sense, but something altogether more mysterious and significant. A sanctuary created through art and sustained by belief, a place where the normal laws of reality bent to accommodate forms of existence that had been deemed impossible or unacceptable by the established order. This painted realm had been created not through divine fiat or natural process, but through the intersection of artistic vision and spiritual necessity, a work of imagination that had achieved such depth and completeness that it had become real in ways that transcended the usual boundaries between creation and reality. The world existed within a painting, but it was also more than a painting, a living testament to the power of consciousness to create new forms of existence when conventional approaches had proven inadequate to address the needs of those who sought refuge and renewal. The goddess who had inspired this painted sanctuary was known throughout the realm by many names and titles, but her true identity remained shrouded in mystery and speculation. Some called her Velka, the goddess of sin, recognizing in her the embodiment of divine justice that operated according to principles more fundamental than the arbitrary preferences of ruling powers. Others knew her as a rogue deity, one who had separated herself from the established pantheon to pursue purposes that challenged the conventional understanding of what divine authority should represent. But regardless of what name was used to invoke her presence, the goddess who had made the painted world possible possessed qualities that set her apart from the other divine beings who shaped the Age of Fire, where they sought to impose order through control and maintain stability through the suppression of change. She embraced the transformative potential that existed within apparent chaos and disorder, understanding that true peace could only emerge from the integration of opposing forces rather than the dominance of one over another. The painted world served as both sanctuary and laboratory, a place where beings who had been rejected by conventional society could explore forms of existence that were forbidden or impossible in the outside world. The inhabitants of this realm were not refugees in the traditional sense, fleeing from persecution or disaster, but explorers of consciousness who had chosen exile in order to pursue understanding and development that remained unavailable within the constraints of normal reality. Among these inhabitants was Priscilla, the crossbreed whose very existence challenged the categories that had been used to organize and understand the different forms of life that populated the realm. Her mixed heritage, combining elements of divine and draconic nature, in ways that should have been impossible, made her a living symbol of the potential for transcending the artificial boundaries that separated different types of consciousness and experience. Priscilla's presence in the painted world was not the result of imprisonment or exile imposed by others, but a choice made in recognition that her nature required forms of protection and development that could not be provided within the rigid structures of conventional society. The painted world offered her not just safety, but the opportunity to explore the full implications of her hybrid existence without fear of persecution or misunderstanding. The life huntability that made Priscilla so feared by those who preferred clear distinctions between life and death represented a natural expression of consciousness that existed between different states of being. This was not a power to be suppressed or contained, but a capability that revealed new possibilities for understanding and working with the fundamental forces that governed existence. In the painted world, where such abilities were seen as gifts rather than threats, Priscilla could develop her nature without the constraints that had made her unwelcome elsewhere. The painting guardians who protected the realm from those who would disturb its peace were not wardens keeping prisoners confined, but sentinels defending a sacred space from those who lacked the understanding or preparation necessary to appreciate what they might find there. Their positioning with backs turned to the painting itself demonstrated that their purpose was not to prevent escape, but to prevent inappropriate intrusion, ensuring that only those who truly belonged in the sanctuary would be able to enter and remain. The painted world of Ariamis served its purpose for centuries, providing refuge and opportunity for development to countless beings who had been abandoned or rejected by the conventional structures of the Age of Fire. But like all things that existed within the artificial framework of the preserved age, it too began to show signs of the strain and corruption that characterized the final phases of the cosmic cycle that was drawing toward its inevitable conclusion. The decay that began to manifest within the painted world was not the natural process of aging and renewal that characterized healthy forms of existence, but the artificial stagnation that resulted from being cut off from the larger currents of transformation that connected all living things. The realm's isolation, which had been its greatest strength during the earlier periods when it served as sanctuary for the unwanted, became a limitation as the need for genuine renewal and growth exceeded what could be achieved within its bounded environment. The painted world of Ariandel represented an attempt to address this crisis through the application of will and determination rather than wisdom and understanding. Sister Freed, whose devotion to preserving the painted world's beauty and tranquility was absolute and uncompromising, sought to prevent the decay through the same kind of artificial preservation that had characterized the gods' approach to maintaining the Age of Fire beyond its natural lifespan. Fride's methods, though motivated by genuine love for the realm and its inhabitants, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what the painted world represented and what it needed to continue fulfilling its purpose. Her attempts to halt the natural processes of change and renewal that were trying to assert themselves within the realm created the same kind of stagnation and ultimate corruption that had plagued the outside world under similar attempts at artificial preservation. The inhabitants of Ariandel found themselves trapped not just within the painted world, but within a single moment of that world's existence, prevented from growing or changing by a protector whose love had become indistinguishable from tyranny. The very beauty that Fride sought to preserve began to turn septic under the influence of her artificial constraints, creating forms of corruption that were all the more tragic because they emerged from such pure intentions. It was in this context of failed preservation and accumulating decay that the old knight Gael began his own quest, driven not by grand cosmic visions or political ambitions, but by simple devotion to a single individual whose welfare meant more to him than his own survival or the fate of the world itself. The young painter whose art had the power to create new painted worlds was running out of pigment, and without the proper materials, she could not complete the work that would allow the cycle of renewal to continue as it should. Gael's understanding of what the painter needed went deeper than mere artistic supplies. The pigment she required was not something that could be found through conventional means, but the very essence of the dark soul itself, concentrated and purified through processes that could only be achieved at the end of all things, when the accumulated fragments of humanity's scattered soul could finally be gathered into a form that would serve the purposes of genuine creation rather than endless preservation. The quest that Gael undertook to obtain this pigment was perhaps the most selfless act of love in the entire history of the Age of Fire, undertaken not in hope of personal glory or cosmic significance, but out of simple dedication to enabling someone else to achieve their creative potential. He understood that the journey would likely cost him everything he was and everything he had been, but he accepted this cost willingly because he could not bear the thought of his beloved painter being unable to complete her work. The painted world that the young artist envisioned was not simply another refuge for the unwanted or forgotten, but something genuinely new and different. A realm that would be cold, dark, and gentle, qualities that seemed contradictory, but actually represented a form of existence that transcended the violent oppositions that had characterized all previous forms of reality. This world would be cold, in the sense of being free from the burning passions that had driven so much destruction, dark in the sense of embracing the mystery and potential that existed in the spaces between defined categories, and gentle in the sense of welcoming all forms of consciousness without demanding that they conform to predetermined patterns. The creation of such a world required not just artistic skill, but deep understanding of the principles that governed consciousness and reality, wisdom that could only be gained through direct experience of the full spectrum of existence, from its highest peaks to its darkest valleys. The painter possessed the vision and the technique necessary for such creation, but she lacked the essential material that would allow her vision to be realized in forms that could provide genuine sanctuary for those who would inhabit it. Gael's journey to obtain this material led him through the Dreg Heap, that place where all the failed kingdoms and abandoned dreams of the Age of Fire had come to rest like sediment at the bottom of a vast ocean of time. Here, in this landscape built from the accumulated refuse of centuries, the true cost of the world's artificial preservation became visible in ways that no amount of theoretical understanding could have conveyed. The Dreg Heap was not merely a collection of physical ruins, but a repository of broken dreams and failed aspirations, a monument to all the lives that had been sacrificed to maintain an order that had proven incapable of sustaining itself through natural means. Every beautiful city, every golden age of prosperity, every period of peace and creativity had been built upon foundations of suffering that had been carefully hidden from view. And here those foundations were finally exposed in all their tragic reality. Moving through this landscape of accumulated loss and abandoned hope, Gael began to understand the true magnitude of what the painter was attempting to achieve. She was not simply creating another painted world that would serve as temporary refuge from the problems of existence, but working to establish a form of reality that could learn from all the mistakes of the past while avoiding the traps that had ensnared every previous attempt at creating sustainable civilization. The ringed city that lay beyond the Dreg Heap represented both the culmination of divine attempts to control humanity and the preservation of humanity's true nature in forms that had remained relatively uncorrupted by the various institutional pressures that had shaped human development. Elsewhere, This ancient prison, disguised as a gift, had inadvertently served as a laboratory where the deepest potentials of the dark soul could develop without interference from the cycles of sacrifice and renewal that had distorted human bodies. Consciousness throughout most of the Age of Fire. The inhabitants of the Ringed City had maintained their connection to the original vision of the furtive Pygmy through centuries of apparent subjugation, preserving forms of knowledge and capability that had been lost or suppressed in the outside world. Their collective wisdom about the true nature of the dark soul and its proper development would prove essential to the completion of the painter's work and the creation of the new world that would emerge from the ashes of all previous ages. The breaking of the seal that had maintained the Ringed City's isolation marked the beginning of the final phase in the long transformation that had been unfolding since the first fragmentation of the dark soul. The revelation that followed exposed not just the hidden truth about humanity's situation, but the deeper reality that all of existence had been caught in patterns of artificial preservation that had outlived whatever purpose they might once have served. Gael's gathering of the dark soul's essence from the inhabitants of this revealed world was both a tragic necessity and a fulfillment of the original purpose for which the soul had been fragmented so many ages ago. The blood that he collected through his desperate quest was not stolen or conquered, but freely given by beings who understood that their individual sacrifice would enable the creation of something that could benefit all consciousness, providing forms of existence that would be genuinely sustainable and genuinely nurturing of whatever sought refuge within them. The journey that led to this ultimate revelation began in the Dreg Heap, that vast accumulation of discarded ages and forgotten civilizations, where all the failed attempts at preserving the Age of Fire had come to their final rest. This landscape existed outside the normal flow of time, a place where past and present existed simultaneously in layers that could be peeled back like the pages of an immense book written in stone and ruin. Here, among the wreckage of countless kingdoms and the bones of numberless heroes, the true cost of the world's artificial preservation was laid bare for any who possessed the courage to look upon it without turning away. The architecture of the Dreg Heap defied conventional understanding, as buildings from different eras and different kingdoms had been pressed together by forces that operated beyond normal comprehension of space and causality. Towers that had once reached toward the heavens in proud declaration of their builders' ambitions now lay sideways across valleys, serving as bridges between hills that had been formed from the compressed ruins of other cities. The very stones seemed to whisper with the voices of those who had shaped them, carrying echoes of dreams and aspirations that had been abandoned when their realms fell to the inexorable advance of time and entropy. Moving through this landscape required not just physical endurance but spiritual resilience, the ability to maintain hope and purpose while surrounded by evidence of the ultimate futility of all previous attempts to create lasting meaning and beauty. The Dreg Heap was a monument to the failure of conventional approaches to the problems of existence, a testament to the inadequacy of force and will when applied to challenges that required wisdom and understanding rather than mere determination. Yet the heap also contained within its chaotic arrangement seeds of genuine hope, for among the ruins of so many failed civilizations lay evidence of achievements and insights that had transcended the limitations of their time and place. The accumulated knowledge and wisdom of ages had not been entirely lost but preserved in forms that could be recovered by those who understood how to look beneath the surface of apparent destruction to find the enduring truths that remained hidden within. The angels that haunted the Dreg Heap, those mysterious beings whose origin and purpose remained unclear even to the most learned scholars, served as both guardians and guides for those who journeyed through this realm of accumulated endings. They were not angels in any conventional religious sense, but manifestations of the deep longing for transcendence that had motivated so many of the civilizations whose remains lay scattered throughout the heap. These beings embodied the aspiration towards something higher and more meaningful that had driven countless generations to sacrifice themselves in pursuit of ideals that always seemed to slip away just as they came within reach. Their presence in the dreg heap suggested that even failure and abandonment could not entirely extinguish the spark of hope that drove consciousness to seek forms of existence that transcended the limitations of ordinary reality. The path through the dreg heap led inevitably to the ringed city, that ancient prison paradise, where humanity's true heritage had been preserved in forms that had remained relatively uncorrupted by the cycles of artificial renewal that had distorted human development throughout most of the age of fire. The approach to this city required passage through barriers and defenses that had been designed not just to keep its inhabitants contained, but to protect them from the various forms of corruption and manipulation that had shaped human consciousness elsewhere. The ringed city itself existed in a state of temporal suspension that preserved it not just from external interference, but from the natural processes of change and development that should have characterized any living community. This preservation was maintained through the power of Princess Filianore, whose eternal slumber served as both blessing and curse, protecting the city's inhabitants, while also preventing them from participating in the larger transformations that were reshaping the nature of existence itself. The city's architecture reflected the hybrid nature of its purpose, combining elements of divine grandeur with human creativity in ways that created something genuinely new and beautiful. The buildings rose in harmonious spirals that seemed to defy gravity, while following principles of construction that drew upon both divine knowledge and human ingenuity. The streets were arranged according to patterns that facilitated community and connection, while providing spaces for solitude and contemplation when such needs arose. The inhabitants of the ringed city had developed during their centuries of isolation into something that was recognizably human, but also touched by qualities that exceeded normal human limitations. Their dark soul fragments, concentrated and refined through generations of careful cultivation within the city's protected environment, had achieved levels of development that approached the divine while remaining grounded in the essential humanity that was their true inheritance from the furtive Pygmy. These Pygmy lords, as they had come to be known, possessed capabilities that surpassed anything that had been seen in human populations elsewhere. They could work directly with the fabric of reality itself, reshaping matter and energy according to their will, while maintaining the kind of wisdom and restraint that prevented such power from becoming destructive. Their magic was not the crude manipulation of external forces that characterized most sorcery, but a subtle art that operated through harmony and cooperation rather than domination and control. But perhaps most significantly, they had maintained their connection to the original vision of the furtive Pygmy, understanding their role not as rulers or masters, but as stewards of humanity's true nature and potential. They saw themselves as temporary custodians of power and knowledge that ultimately belonged to all who carried fragments of the dark soul, responsible for preserving and developing these gifts until the time came when they could be shared with the broader human community. The breaking of the seal that had maintained the ringed city's isolation came not through conquest or violence, but through a gentle touch that awakened Princess Filianore from her eternal slumber. This simple action, performed by hands that carried no malice or desire for destruction, shattered the temporal barriers that had preserved the city, while also revealing the true state of the world that lay beyond its protected boundaries. The flash of light that accompanied the seal's breaking was not destruction but revelation, stripping away the illusions that had hidden the world's true condition and exposing the reality that had been carefully concealed behind layers of comfortable deception. What this revelation exposed was a landscape that had already moved beyond the age of fire, a realm of ash and sand, where the remnants of all previous attempts at artificial preservation lay buried beneath the weight of accumulated time. The sun that hung in the sky above this wasteland was not the bright orb of Gwyn's creation, but a hollow shell, its light failing as the fire that had sustained it for so long finally exhausted the last reserves of divine essence that had been fed to its hunger. This was not a catastrophe that might still be prevented, but a conclusion that had already been reached, hidden from view only by the power of illusions that had finally been stripped away. In this wasteland of endings, where the accumulated ash of countless linkings lay thick upon the ground, and the wind carried only the echoes of long-dead dreams, Gael finally achieved the goal that had driven him through so much suffering and sacrifice. But the dark soul's blood that he obtained came at a price that transformed him beyond recognition, consuming his consciousness and replacing his gentle devotion with a hunger that could never be satisfied regardless of how much it devoured. The transformation of Gael from devoted protector into ravenous beast was perhaps the most tragic outcome of any quest undertaken during the entire Age of Fire, representing the ultimate cost of pursuing even the most noble goals within a system that had become so corrupted that it perverted every effort to work within its confines. His love for the painter, pure and selfless in its original form, became a maddening obsession that drove him to consume everything he encountered in a futile attempt to gather enough essence to satisfy her needs. Yet even in his transformed state, even as his consciousness was overwhelmed by the very forces he had sought to harness for creative purposes, Gael retained enough awareness of his original purpose to recognize what the arrival of another represented. His final battle was not motivated by malice or territorial defense, but by a desperate hope that his sacrifice might finally achieve the goal for which he had given up everything he was and everything he had been. The confrontation between Gael and the one who had come seeking the Dark Soul's blood was simultaneously the most violent and the most gentle encounter in the entire saga of the Age of Fire's decline. It was violent because it involved the destruction of a being whose power had grown to cosmic proportions, whose very existence threatened to unravel the fabric of reality through the chaotic hunger that consumed him. But it was gentle because it represented the final act of love between beings who shared the same ultimate purpose, the necessary mercy that allowed Gael's sacrifice to achieve its intended meaning. The blood of the Dark Soul that was finally obtained through this tragic conclusion was more than mere pigment for artistic creation. It was the concentrated essence of humanity's journey through all the ages since the original fragmentation, containing within its dark substance the accumulated wisdom, suffering, hope, and love of countless generations who had struggled to preserve their essential nature, while adapting to circumstances that challenged every assumption about what human existence could encompass. This blood represented not just the power to create new painted worlds, but the knowledge necessary to create them well, informed by understanding of all the mistakes that had led to the failure of previous attempts at sustainable civilization. It carried within it the memory of every tragedy that had resulted from the separation of power from wisdom, every catastrophe that had emerged from the attempt to preserve order through the suppression of natural change, every form of corruption that had grown from the artificial prolongation of systems beyond their natural lifespan. But most importantly, the Dark Soul's blood contained the original vision of the furtive Pygmy, the understanding that true strength comes from connection rather than domination, from sharing rather than hoarding, from the cultivation of collective wisdom rather than the concentration of individual power. This vision had survived every attempt at suppression or perversion, had endured through every cycle of linking and renewal, had remained intact within the hidden networks that connected human consciousness across time and space. The return to the painted world with this precious material marked not just the completion of Gael's quest, but the beginning of a new phase in the evolution of consciousness itself. The young painter who received the Dark Soul's blood understood that she was being entrusted with more than artistic supplies. She was being given the means to create forms of existence that could learn from all the accumulated experience of previous ages, while avoiding the traps and limitations that had made those ages ultimately unsustainable. The new painted world that would emerge from her work would not be simply another refuge for the unwanted, or another experiment in alternative governance, but a fundamental breakthrough in the relationship between consciousness and reality, a demonstration that the ancient dichotomies that had defined all previous forms of existence could be transcended through art, love, and patient understanding of the deeper principles that govern the interaction between individual and collective awareness. As we reach the end of our journey through the deepest mysteries of the Dark Soul, we find that the furtive Pygmy's story is ultimately one of patience, endurance, and transformation. Though easily forgotten in the grand tales of gods and dragons, this small figure's decision to share the Dark Soul among many rather than hoard it alone ensured that humanity would outlast every age and every cycle. The Pygmy understood what the other lords did. Not that true strength comes not from individual power, but from the bonds that connect all living things. In fragmenting the soul, they created not weakness, but resilience, not division, but unity across countless individual lives. The painted worlds that emerged from this ancient wisdom offer gentle sanctuary where consciousness can finally rest from the endless cycles of struggle and sacrifice. So as you drift towards sleep, remember that you carry within yourself a fragment of that primordial darkness, not as a curse, but as a gift, the capacity for choice, for growth, for creating something beautiful from the ashes of what came before. Rest now in the knowledge that every ending is also a beginning. Every darkness contains the seed of new light, and every soul, no matter how small or forgotten, has the power to reshape the world through love, patience, and gentle persistence.